because we're doing 5 and 6, we'll call you together. Laura Lake, come up at this time. Sandy Brown, Carolyn Magerson, Pat McCosker. You all come up at this time and be at the podium. Yes, you can start now.
Thank you very much, members of the committee. I represent Save Westwood Village, and I'm here with some suggested alternatives to your alternatives, and in opposition to P3. An EIR is required for this. I don't believe that you've obtained consents and waivers from covenant holders and easement holders for this, for P3. And instead, I suggest that you immediately authorize the city attorney to collect all funds owed to the city, save the money you're using on worthless collection services, and raise monthly rates at all city parking lots and garages. That doesn't interfere with retail activities. And mortgage these garages, use them as collateral. There's more than enough revenue to service a debt of probably between $400 and $500 million. We know the city needs money. We don't want to see services cut. We think there are practical, immediate alternatives, and I would really appreciate your consideration. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, just a point of order. Miguel, when you get a chance, I'd like you to respond to this because there's a whole series of folks talking about this, including David Ewing from Venice, who has an issue on it, as she has.
One other point. The agenda says that no community impact statements were filed. This is incorrect. 2 have been filed. One from Studio City Neighborhood Council and one from the Westwood Neighborhood Council. And I'd like to submit copies of each of them for the record.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's just point of order that later, Miguel, would you respond to what we're hearing from the community? Thank you.
Next, Sandy Brown. We can also ask Carol Magnuson and Pat McCosker to come up.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Sandy Brown. I'm here representing the Holmby Westwood Property Owners Association, which is the association adjacent to the Broxton Garage in Westwood. I want to refer to the attachment 1, the supplemental attachment and recommendations to the alternative plan, Miguel Santana's letter of January the 7th, 2011 to the mayor. What I find most interesting is the spin of what you have done in regard to the police services that will be jeopardized. The attachment says that 170,000 hours of furlough days would be necessary at a savings of $5.4 million. Yet, of the $53 million that you're going to be garnering from the sale of the garages, a mere $200,000 would be going to the police. That's less than 1/3 of 1% of the projected sale of the 9 city garages. My question is, why is the city reducing police by millions if we don't sell the garages, but giving them only a pittance of the revenue if we do sell the garages? And I also want you to take a look at Dunn. You know, I've had a constant going back and forth with Dunn over the years. Only 320 hours of furlough days at a savings of $12,000 would be taken from Dunn. Yet they give $45,000 away to 91 groups across the city for such things as street banners, newsletters, website, outreach, barbecues, dinners, food, all of those things which I find are not important compared to the police. So I would ask you just to look at the alternatives and see if there isn't another way that the city can bring together this deficit. Thank you.
Thank you. Carol Magnuson.
Carol Magnuson. Good afternoon, councilpersons. My name is Carol Magnuson. I'm the past president of the Westwood Hills Property Owners Association and a member of the board of directors of the Westwood Community Council. These are two of the many organizations that from throughout the city that have stepped forward in opposition to the P3 proposal, and I'm sure they join me in congratulating you on seeking alternatives to this unfortunate proposal. I have with me petitions from 700 individuals in the immediate Westwood community who are in opposition to the sale of the parking garages, and I understand that you will be receiving another 2,000 petitions tomorrow. I mention that just to indicate the depth and breadth of the concern throughout the community about this proposal, which seems to many individuals to be short-sighted, and I am heartened that the council members, I believe, are also coming to view this proposal that would trade 1 year of income for 50 years of income as not a very good deal for the city or the community. Our community, and I'll speak of Westwood specifically because I've been active in Westwood for 40 years. During most of that time, we worked diligently to get a parking structure as a means to help revive our community. We waited a long time for it. It's a keystone in our revitalization efforts, and it would be a devastating blow to our businesses if the city were to take it away. And it would be one that we would have a very hard time forgiving. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Here are my petitions.
Ms. McCosker, also David Ewing, Jim McQuiston, and Gavin Kuhn.
Thank you. Pat McCosker, President of United Firefighters. I don't know whether you should sell the parking garages or not, but I know what you shouldn't do, and that is further decimate your fire and paramedic services in this city. I started my morning this morning by going to the hospital to visit one of the 3 injured members we had yesterday. Individual had a fire who had his skull fractured and internal injuries, and it was just coming out of it, basically, just opening his eyes when I got there. That was at the smaller fire closer to downtown. At the fire out in Baldwin Hills, we had 2 others individuals injured, and I spoke to both of them this morning. They were injured by collapsing ceiling. One of them knocked out there as well, so similar injuries there. I tell you this to say how dangerous our job is. Our job is dangerous every day, but it's much more dangerous when we're closing 22 fire companies, 9 ambulances, 2/3 of our hazmat units, 2/3 now of our paramedic supervisors. That's what's going on right now. So we need that restored, not more closures on top of that. What the CIO is proposing, if you don't sell the garages, and again, I don't care whether you do or don't, just what you do with your fire service. He's proposing 7 to 8 more companies closed. That would be 30 fire companies every day, or their equivalent, I suppose, because it's non-specific. It is more specific about furloughing people, though. He's proposing for the first time that you furlough firefighters that are in desk jobs. I noticed, by the way, that there's no proposal to furlough police officers in desk jobs, and we do know from discussions here that more of them are doing civilian work. That's not the case with my people. My people are there, against their will, quite frankly, either because they've been injured on the job, and that's the only thing that they can do now in many cases, or because they have to be. Those are public safety positions only. To put them off work one day every week or however it would be to impact public safety and be deeply unfair to them and to the public that we serve. So please don't. I said this morning at the kitchen table, having worked at the firehouse yesterday, to the guys and talking about this, I said, unfortunately, I'm convinced at this point the only thing that might change what's going on here is the death of a firefighter. And I hope and pray that isn't the case. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ewing, Mr. McQuiston.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is David Ewing. I'm a resident of the Venice area, have been for a long time. I'm here to speak against the proposal for the long-term lease on the parking garages. It seems like a bad financial deal. It's a short-term fix to paper over a problem and selling off our future to do it. There are other ways that this can be approached. Somebody already mentioned the idea essentially of mortgaging the garages, get the same amount of money up front or more without selling off your control of the parking. If private capital can make money on these garages, so can the city. If the city can't, then there's something wrong with the way we're running the city. It needs to be fixed. But selling off this asset for long-term is part of a pattern that's taken place over the last 2 years since the investment banks got bailed out by the federal government, have a lot of money in their pockets. They see the states and the municipalities are starving, and they're coming around picking up assets at bargain basement prices. And I gave a handout to all of you. It's an article by Matt Taibbi. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's a wonderful writer from Rolling Stone, has been writing on the topic of the financial meltdown, the various players involved, and interactions with the federal government. And this is a chapter from his book, Griftopia. It's also a standalone article in Rolling Stone about how states and municipalities are selling off their infrastructure assets under these stressed conditions, and about who's ultimately picking them up. And largely, it's sovereign wealth funds from the Middle East, who also, at this point, are just looking for places to put their money. And they're doing it through a lot of sort of front companies and so forth. So please, when you get a chance, take a look at that. But if I can just take a second, if you can...
Very, very short, sir.
You should be able to set up a standalone independent vehicle to carry these garages and float a bond that will not be affected by the city's bond rating, that have its own, that will be its own standalone entity. Thank you very much.
Mr. McQuiston?
Talk about that bond thing.
Jim McQuiston, you have my statement, and you'll notice that item 1 in the statement says, gee whiz, you know, there's 54.954.2 that says you got to advertise what you're doing. And I looked in the file, and I noticed that the only other statement besides mine, which was in the file, didn't even mention the fact that you were going to talk about the budget in this particular thing. He was concerned about selling off the asset. And most of the people who have testified here are talking about that. But actually, the meat of this, the gravamen, is on the budget. And unfortunately, it was not advertised right, because we really need to talk about it. But it's going to have to be put off at least till Thursday, and maybe until next Monday, talking about the budget impact. You have my statement. You'll notice that it would be impossible for this city to institute this before the end of the fiscal year. So we're talking about something that's really pie in the sky here. However, there are a lot of problems with the fix, and I'm very, very upset with the CAO and the CLA, but especially with the mayor. This should have been fixed a long time ago. We've pointed this out many, many times, and here we are still going down the drain.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sands and Mr. Raines. I'm sorry, Mr. Coombs, I'm sorry.
Councilmember Parks, did you call Steve Sand? I just want to make sure I heard my name correctly.
Okay, fine.
Okay,
Mr.
thank you
Coombs
very
is
much.
right- Mr.
Thank you
Coombs
very
is
much.
right afterward.
Honorable council members, my name is Stephen Sand. I'm the chairman of the Westwood Community Council. I'm also the chairman of the Westwood Village Business Association. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address this Budget and Finance Committee. Council members, I know you've heard loud and clear from virtually every corner of the city, from the harbor to the valley, from the east side to the west side, downtown Hollywood, Westwood to the ocean. We don't think there's a single community that thinks this is a good idea. And I really can't believe that any of the council members, any of you sitting around this horseshoe, in your heart of hearts, could possibly think this is a good idea. I think you all know it's a disaster. And it's very unfortunate that we're hearing that people feel that they've been backed into a corner, with no alternative. You've got 3 weeks to act, or disaster is going to befall the city. Let me tell you the disaster that is going to befall the city, not in 3 weeks, but for the next 50 years. Because you're going to take a community like ours in Westwood Village, which should be, by everyone's expectation, one of the economic hubs of commerce, of education, of arts, vitality, medicine, a hub that is generating a huge amount of sales tax revenue. You're going to take this community that is such a treasure, and you're going to hobble it for the next half century. You're going to take away our only public parking garage, a meager 366 spaces, when Century City has about 3,000, the Westside Pavilion has about 3,000, Beverly Hills has about 4,000. We have such a pittance. We fought for 40 years to get that pittance of parking, and now you're going to take it away for 50 years. And what's worse, the city is unthinkably going to agree to not establish any other public parking within an eighth of a mile of any one of these 9, or now we hear it's 12 garages, which means that Westwood will have no public parking for the next 50 years. You are literally stepping over dollars to pick up pennies, pennies that will get you through just the next few months, maybe 9 months, and then we'll be back here in 9 months and we'll be talking about selling off the meters or something else. I urge you to look at these alternatives. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Kuhn. And then next is Tony Range.
My name is Gavin Kuhn. I'm the business representative, Local 501, part of the City Coalition of Unions. The discussion today is about the alternative plans being proposed by the CAO. And all the reasons even is coming about is the discussion of P3 had started months ago when the City Council adopted the budget for this year, included the sale, and now, of course, the discussion of whether or not we're going to do it or not. I'm not going to comment on the pro or con on that. I am going to comment on the alternative plan. I urge you not to support the plan as written, because in our opinion, the CAO has not developed enough alternatives with all participating partners involved with this process. The plan as written is, in our mind, very damaging to the city and services, and there are alternatives that have not been discussed. The coalition is in discussions with the CAO on alternatives, and they have not seen their way through. We have 6 months left on the existing budget. There's no reason to drop in a draconian plan this early. There's ways that things can be mitigated over time. We have 6 months left. Again, I urge you not to support the plan as written, and I would urge that you instruct the CAO to go back and to incorporate all parties in rewriting an alternative plan. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Range, and then also last card, Cheryl Parisi.
Good afternoon, honorable council members. My name is Tony Ranger, and I am the president of Topa Management Company. That is John Anderson, real estate entity, same John Anderson School of Business at UCLA. I come and speak out against the Proposition P3 for the perspective of a landlord and for a real estate perspective that I wanted to share with you. This village of Westwood, of which we're the largest landlord in Westwood Village, and we have about 200,000 square feet, has been languishing for a couple decades. It's probably at its low time. I know we're in a macroeconomic depression or recession still, and for that reason, if someone came to us with a war chest of money and said, would you sell all your properties now, this would be the absolute last time or worst time that I would ever get rid of those properties. You have very valuable parking assets that are there and are the keyhole to basically reviving Westwood Village. I've only been in this presidency job for about 60 days, and we have been working for the last 6 months with my predecessor to try to bring in new companies from other parts of the United States to revive Westwood. If they're to find that the parking is going to no longer be in the control, it will be decimating to the revival of Westwood Village. There are other alternatives, real estate finance-wise, to tap into that value, because I know you're pressed for funds, and I would urge you to alter the plan from the way it sits today and not sell off the most valuable asset in Westwood Village right now at a low time in the economic cycle. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Parisi, then Dr. Clyde Williams and Patricia Good.
Good afternoon. I'm Cheryl Parisi. I'm here representing the Coalition of LA City Unions, representing 22,000 city workers. We're here to remind you that the P3 was adopted by the council as a method to stop the further erosion of city services. The alternative was 1,000 layoffs or moving forward on the P3 plan. These are difficult choices for all of us, but the council has taken the action in the budget we believe that you should move forward expeditiously. I think we are all frustrated that we are here in January when this proposal was adopted and directed by the council to move forward in May of last year. But here we are. It's important to move forward, to move forward quickly, and to understand that we cannot bear the brunt or the consequence of further cuts in city services. Virtually every aspect and every area of our community that receives services from virtually every city department will be impacted by this alternate proposal. It is simply too deep and too much. We need to move forward with the council direction that was adopted in May with the budget for this year. And we ask that you do not deter from that course of action. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Clyde Williams, Patricia Good, and Irma Garcia.
Good afternoon, Dr. Clyde Williams, 4115 Barrett Road, El Sereno, Northeast LA, also a member of the Sierra Club Transportation Committee, which met this last week and voted to keep the parking structures. Hey, why not raise the rates on all parking structures, off-street parking facilities within the city of Los Angeles? We have some of the cheapest in the world. That is $3. Gives me all-day parking. So why can't we get a better system going with the existing resources that we have right now and keep these assets within the city? DWP has a lot of assets. We're not selling them yet. So why sell these when I say they can be made to work? Thank you.
Thank you. Patricia Good, Irma Garcia.
My name is Patricia Good, and I'm from the Angelino Heights area. I'm here because of a cut and a service that's very important for all of Los Angeles and especially for our neighborhood, and that's graffiti removal. They're being threatened with being cut in half, and I've lived in the neighborhood for 30 years, and we used to, the people in our neighborhood used to paint out the graffiti every Sunday morning, really, really early after they did everything. Any kind of event we had in the neighborhood that was maybe publicized, they would paint the graffiti the night before our event that was going to be. We have Central City Action at one of the old fire stations in our neighborhood that paints out the graffiti for all of Council 1 and 13 district, and they're very, very important. They're already short on a lot of their revenue that they had from years ago, or their trucks and things like that. It's something that's extremely important, and because they're official looking, they're not threatened as much. And in our neighborhood, my husband actually was threatened with a gun because he was painting out the graffiti. Somebody from the beautification from City Hall said that Los Angeles without graffiti removal is like New York without snow trucks or snow shovel trucks. So I think you cannot cut this and actually need to give them more money. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Garcia.
Hi, thank you. I'm a resident of the Koreatown area. I live there and work there, and I've seen folks taking off graffiti every day in our neighborhood. And whenever there's a holiday or it's rainy, you can tell that how much impact it has on the communities. It's mostly low income in much of the area that I live in. So I know they will be affected dramatically if you do major cuts in this graffiti removal budget cut. So I ask you, please do not take that away from our communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ray, could you do me a favor and repeat what is before us? Because I think from some of the comments, there are people believing we're going to vote on the P3, and I think the report is an alternate because the P3 hasn't come through, and we want to make sure everybody's clear on what's before the committee.
That is correct. What you have before you this afternoon is a CAO and CLA joint report relative to an alternative plan to the concession agreement for a public-private partnership with respect to the city's parking garages.
Okay, and what's item 6?
And item 6 is the city controller's second general fund budgetary cash flow report for fiscal year 2010-11.
Okay, and let me ask Miguel one question. From your report that's before us, I believe you've given a tentative time in which you intend to address the P3. Could you give the public that information now?
That is correct. The P3 itself will be before your council, the full council, on Wednesday of this week. And that discussion will take place primarily in closed session to discuss various issues that potentially impact the value of that concession. There will obviously also be a public discussion, but it will be on Wednesday of this week.
Okay, on Wednesday of this week, with that closed session and the public comment period, is the expectation that there will be a vote to move one direction or another, or is it information, or what is the expectation?
We believe we've reached a critical point where if we are to proceed forward with this plan, we need direction from the council on various items impacting the potential value of that asset. So we're urging the council to take action no later than this week.
The action would be to either give you clearer direction?
That is correct.
Okay. And then let me just ask the controller to come up so we could deal with item 6 first, and then we'll go to item 5. And then also for the public, we're going to close public comment on item 5 and 6. If someone else presents another card, we'll just put it in file and make sure your name is a part of the file. Ms.
Thank
Blue,
you
item 6.
very much, Mr. Parks, and I will be brief. And thank you for including the cash flow report as part of your discussions on the alternative to the P3 agreement with respect to the city's parking structures. I wanted to raise these issues and present you with the most complete cash flow picture as you move forward to make the difficult decisions on both the P3 proposal before you as well as the other very difficult cuts. As I mentioned in my earlier cash flow status report in October, I've had ongoing concerns about our budgeted revenues, the anticipated receipts from the P3, the impact of a slower economic recovery on tax receipts than anticipated, and adjustments to adopted budget balancing measures that are not cost neutral. The committee and the council have some very difficult decisions to make, and the information provided in this letter supplements, of course, the memo from the CAO and CLA highlighting other areas of concern. What I wanted to talk to you about is a couple of areas. The first, of course, in the general fund revenue, and I'm being joined by Matthias as well, can answer some questions. The non-realization of the P3 receipts would create, as you know, a substantial negative impact on the current year budget. While they would not affect our cash flow, general fund cash flow until late June, the decision about this needs to be going forward as quickly as possible. As you know, the economic recovery is still uncertain, and overall, we've found our receipts to be below plan by about $26 million. It's a result of anticipated lower documentary transfer tax and telephone users' tax receipts. We should not expect and cannot expect a surge in the tax revenues to help balance the budget. The status of the planned business tax receipts will be uncertain, as usual, until early April, and the Office of Finance has accounted for the receipt of the business city taxes at about $412 million. Given the uncertainty from last year's power revenue transfer and the challenges that it raised, the status of the $257 million transfer combined with funds from the Special Parking Revenue Fund of $10 million will be uncertain until after February, adding to my concern. We're also facing uncertainty in special fund reimbursements. The cap rates that were approved by the mayor and council in October dropped from last year's, since our initial estimates were based on last year's rates, and a reduction in anticipated reimbursements of general fund costs may occur. The mayor and council, as we do with the CAO and CLA, must closely monitor plan receipts from allocation of funds to ensure that all transfers occur before the end close of the fiscal year. If they are not processed, reserve fund loans will be required at the end to close our books. Last year it was about 43.2 million, and we don't have, frankly, the same kind of flexibility that we had last year in the reserve fund. The joint CAO-CLA memo assumes also that the operational plans that were discussed in December will generate the $64.2 million in budget deficit offsets. Planned employee attrition and additional allocations from other funds should be revisited to determine if, in fact, we're going to meet that particular, I think, plan and offsets by year end. Of course, because of the economy and the additional $9.5 million that was spent recently on unplanned expenditures for the police department uniform allowance, we need to continue to monitor each department. Again, I know the CAO and CLA are doing that as quickly as possible. And of course, the state budget that was released today. I haven't heard all of the details, but we know that it is going to impact the city of Los Angeles, and particularly our redevelopment in Los Angeles. So I recommended in my memo that a list of all the anticipated receipts from the state by department and fund be compiled to assess the risk before any state action actually occurs. And I think just in closing, for fiscal year 2011 and 12, as has been noted, that we're facing an almost $350 million budget gap for next year. And although this does not occur, the discussion does not occur to the mid-year FSR, I think this is an opportunity for us to begin those discussions in performing that examination. And as we discussed last year in the budget and last spring when the budget was being considered, that we try to use as much conservative revenue projections as possible. And so I know this is a challenging time for the city and a challenging time for all of you, and the difficult discussions you're going to have, but we'll continue to provide you with any cash flow information if there's any change as we go forward, to inform you as quickly as possible, as we did last year with the transfer issue with the Department of Water and Power and others, to let you know where that will have an impact on your discussions.
Okay. When I read your report, the only one item I didn't quite understand was the special parking revenue, $10 million, and I wasn't aware there was that we were contemplating a surplus, and maybe the CAO or CLA can comment on that.
Yes. Well, yes, Councilman, last year in adopting the budget, Council reprogrammed some capital improvement money in the fund to instead be transferred over to the general fund and be posted as general fund receipts, and that amount is $10 million. So I would take it at some point later this fiscal year, there will be a report coming forward that would then request that Council have a finding that there is a surplus in the fund of $10 million and then transferred over to the general fund as general fund receipts. We do have it programmed as part of the cash flow.
We asked that question a while back, and I think we were informed that $10 million was used to balance this year's budget. Is that accurate?
Do you know the answer?
Good afternoon, Councilmember. Janice Chang, Office of the CAO. In the 2011 adopted budget, we did have a $10 million that had originally been set aside, and our office was instructed to put that towards the 10-11 budget into the general
it's
fund.
been spent, so that's what I said, that was the one part of the report of looking at the surplus, because that surplus was spent to balance the 10-11 budget. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So I just want to make sure that that's clear, that there is no 10 million waiting to be found. And so the other issue I wanted to find out, and this is something that on dealing particularly with the cap rate, and this is an area that I think the committee has asked a couple of times for the CAO and the controller, if you could give us a report back on how that cap rate is calculated, and particularly what I personally have been concerned about on the cap rate is I understand clearly why we on grants and charging proprietaries would go with the full overhead. But when we're charging general services to a department such as the police department, why would the police department pay overhead if the employee is already on the payroll in general services? And that's the area that we had asked, could we get some clarity that we understand full cost recovery when there are special funds, grant funds, things of that, bond funds, things of that nature, but when we're just talking general fund work between departments, that cap rate is something that seems needs to be adjusted or reconsidered.
And it was an issue I similarly had as a city council member as well, and looking at that, I think our offices have had discussion in the past, and we will revisit that as well. I think the issue is of consistency with the federal government if we are charging a different cap rate, why that would be, why they would pay for it, and why we wouldn't necessarily internally in those departments. But I think we're more than willing to look at
Because in reality, I think we are paying for it because it's in the human resources account as a budgeted item for that employee that is doing the work. And so that's why I'm just concerned that we charge departments that are dealing with general fund money to pay for what appears to be an item that's already been paid for in a general human resources fund, as opposed to special funds, grant funds, bond funds. So that's what we'd like to get clarified.
Yeah, Mr. Parks, I mean, some of it is sort of accounting and how to charge back costs. The only budget impact is for reimbursements on special funds and grant funds. That would have a budgetary impact if the cap rate is lower, because the transfers from the special funds and grants would be lower.
We don't want to alter those special funds, grants, and bonds. But we consistently see where a general fund department is charging another department for services, they throw the cap rate in, which doesn't appear to be, in my judgment, appropriate when we know we funded that item already in the human resources account for an existing employee. Now, if another department is asking for service and it requires us to hire someone and they're not in the budget, then I can understand the full freight. But not when they are already on the budget and identified on someone's TO. So that's the information that I think we need to get clarified so we can see if there is a better way to manage department by department. The other thing I'd ask, as we ask the CAO and the controller to work on that issue, that we also, because we've had a recent CAP 32 report, if somewhere we can get some idea of what the differences are between CAP 31 and 32, so we get an idea what some of those changes might be that we're now imposing on grants, block bonds, and to the federal government. So those are two things we'd ask the CEO and the controller if you can get back, because I think it's very critical as it relates to the cap rate in general, but specifically general funded departments versus general fund departments.
We'll report back on both of those things.
And if I may, actually, just to highlight your points, we are looking at those issues as part of our report back to make sure there is consistency with our policies, whether they be to external grants, with the feds, the state, proprietary, and then also with the internal departments as well. And as we look at those procedures, we want to make sure they are applied consistently and based on your sort of policy direction. Just in general, as far as the cap, the difference between 31 and 32, there have been some changes as highlighted. I think one of the big things, as I understand it, there's some disallowed costs that were in cap 31 that were not allowed in cap 32. And that's something that's going to have to be explored further as we go and prepare the cap in the future years. So.
Okay. But we'd just like to see what those differences so we're prepared. And then let me ask Jerry and Miguel, from the controller's report, do we have any new information regarding the state budget or revenue projections or the sensitive revenues and things of that nature that we can add to this report if something is new to our attention?
Well, I'll deal with the state budget first. It did just come out this morning, and my staff has been going through, and we're working with the Sacramento office and our consultant up there. Preliminarily, I mean, it's going to be a very dire budget, but we were particularly focusing on the impact on the city. Preliminarily, it looks like there's only one element that could impact us. There's a proposal to eliminate funding for the Public Library Foundation, the California Library Literacy and English Acquisition Services, and the California Library Services Act. Now, the Department of Libraries gets about $1.3 million from these sources. So that could be a direct impact on the library. There is no take of transportation funding. Of course, as I'm sure, as we expected, there is a proposal to eliminate entirely all redevelopment agencies within the state. They would set up a separate redevelopment agency statewide for oversight to pay off the bond obligations, but in essence, all of the agencies would stop functioning. They're also proposing to eliminate the enterprise zones. Those are tax credits, as you well know, for investment within those areas. So we're going to have to be working with CDD to assess the impact on that. Now, there are clearly long-term impacts on our budget, and there are long-term impacts on economic development, but in terms of immediate impacts beyond the 1.3 so far, we haven't seen anything.
Let me ask you, just so the public's aware, when we talk about tax credits, we deal with them in, I guess, a couple of different ways for ongoing business incentives, but does it also impact the tax credits for building affordable housing and people applying for those types of resources? Are they the same pot, or is it different forms of tax credits?
Well, actually, the one element of the CRA, the housing money, will continue to be allocated to affordable housing. We'll have to check on the enterprise zone funding to see how much housing impact there might be. But on the redevelopment agency function itself, that housing money would continue to be set aside and allocated to affordable housing.
Okay. Miguel, anything else on projected revenues?
No, I think that Jerry summed it, has the most current knowledge on the state budget.
And Mr. Parks, March 1st, we present to you our revenue projections for the upcoming year, and we'll keep you informed on that. We're meeting with a number of the economists to talk about some of the trends going forward, and actually have been involving the CAO's office in those meetings, so they have been present in any of those briefings that we've had as well.
Okay, and that's March?
March 1st.
Okay. And then, Miguel, when is mid-year FSR?
We're hoping to submit the mid-year in February, mid-February.
Okay, very good. Colleagues, any questions to the controller before we get to item 5?
Ms. Gruhl, just a quick question. You talked about the $26 million shortfall, and some of the streams we've seen continued drop in some of our revenue streams, not to the degree it was, but continuing to drop. Obviously, that'll affect our ability for a trans later in the year. One, to get a trans, and two, the amount we need. Last year, we topped $1 billion. Do you have any projections on where it may be going this year if the trend lines continue?
As far as the revenue,
the
TRAN,
Yeah.
I guess I would look to both Matthias and to Miguel as where we think.
You got $26 million just in this report. You said other trend lines continue to drop, so.
I mean, one of them, particularly in the documentary transfer tax, which was the $111 million, which we're not anticipating, the 105 is what we've really focused on. That additional 6 is for the county going after some of the business side of that, and not a change in policy, but looking at particularly how they've been going after individuals for documentary transfer tax. So what we focused on really was even just the $105 million necessarily. So I think with the TRAN, again, it will all be focused on how much it costs you. I don't think necessarily at this point we would say we weren't eligible to be able to have a TRAN going forward.
But I think your question was, how much do we anticipate borrowing? Was that?
What is the additional slippage from the 1.1 billion we did last year?
Yeah, we did. We borrowed how much last year?
It was about 1.1.
We borrowed 1.2. We borrowed 1.2 to the TRAN. I would be surprised if it's less than that next year.
Less than that?
Yes.
Okay.
And that's simply a factor because of our increasing costs for pensions, basically for pension department and LACERs. A big part of our trans is to prepay both of those payments.
Well, that's encouraging at least, although obviously it's getting harder and harder to sell those items in the marketplace too. So municipal bonds are shrinking rapidly in the marketplace. So, okay, well, that'll be continued. I just want to know what the direction was.
Let me just ask a follow-up, Mr. Smith, question. How do we expect to have a smaller trans if this fiscal year we're talking about $900 million in medical and pensions alone?
We're not expecting a small. I said I would be surprised if it's less than what we borrowed last year. Yes.
That's not what you said. It's not quite
I'm sorry. I may have not been clear enough. No, it's. No, at minimum, 1.2 is what we borrowed last year. I would anticipate that number to go up because, as Ray said, the driver is the the costs primarily through our pension. So that's really, the cash flow number, fluctuates as well, but the biggest driver is the increase in pension costs.
So you say you're surprised if it's less than
okay, 1.2.
And we had a very hard time marketing 1.2.
Yes, I mean, certainly it's exactly for that reason that we're recommending moving forward on reductions now, and why it's important to maintain the reserve fund that we have today at minimum, because all of that impacts our ability to borrow.
Okay, and then when we just did some recent bonds, we had a hard time selling some of those in the market. As I recall reading, the interest rate is actually becoming an impediment to selling municipal bonds as well as municipal credit ratings across the country. So it's going to be harder in this year's atmosphere to sell those bonds, and if we increase it, it's going to become exponentially harder on top of that.
Correct. Natalie Brill from CEO's office. Basically, the interest rates have started to creep up. So, we're 6 months away. We're hoping they go down a little bit. And you're right. The bigger our TRAN is, the harder it is to sell right now.
I think what needs to be sort of the takeaway is there are a number of factors that go into the trans. I mean, we mentioned the pension and retirement payment, but there also is the cash flow portion. Depending on the cash flow needs for the city and the controller for next year, that is one factor. Certainly, if we continue to decide to prepay those payments, that is another a factor that we have to look at. We have to, through Natalie and her group, working with the FA, determines whether or not it's worth it to prepay versus pay on a biweekly basis. So there's a number of things that need to be considered. Certainly, the market is a big piece of that.
On the question of the TRAN, I think that one of the primary drivers behind our recommendation before you is that we do everything we can to preserve our credit rating. And obviously, to the extent that our credit rating is impacted, it impacts the interest rate. Any further decline puts us out of the market of certain kinds of borrowing. And I'll have Natalie just briefly touch on that.
The Securities and Exchange Commission, they dictate what rating mutual funds have to maintain their bonds at, and it's basically AA. And we're currently at a AA minus. So if we're downgraded once again, we'll be A+. And it would basically prohibit certain mutual funds from investing. And those are the big funds. Yeah. So that
takes us out of 90% of the market if we're downgraded? Is that what, as I recall?
I'm sorry?
It removes us from the ability to sell to 90% of the market?
To those mutual funds. Correct. Yeah. To the mutual funds that buy tax-exempt TRAN. Now, that's short-term. The other thing that happened is with all the financial crisis that was going on, mutual funds were required to shorten the amount of tax-exempt short-term debt they had in their portfolio. They were previously allowed to have a lot of 90-day and 120-day. The federal government has pretty much limited them to a lot of 60-day, which means that if we want to issue TRAN, we have to pay it back sooner. We can't go all the way to June anymore.
So the deeper in debt we go, the more the federal government works against us.
Yes.
Yeah.
But, this is all in response to trying to protect, you and me, the small investor.
The guys are forcing into bankruptcy. Thanks a lot.
Just a few questions for the great Madam Controller. Property taxes, okay? It's the end of the year. Do you have any sense of what kind of property taxes have been collected by the county, and are we on target for the kind of percentage we should be getting on property tax?
Well, the next one is due it's due February. We had this conversation before, who pays in the actual February, but actually late if they come in April.
Yeah.
And so we'll have a better idea then. Both Rex from the CAO and Matthias have been keeping a close eye with that, and I don't know if you want to give anything.
Do you know anything about December, what we got in December? Because that's the first part, if not the whole part, depending upon who you're talking to.
Yes, Matthias Farfan with the controller. We are on track on the property tax, and actually we are a little, since we did receive a little bit this year that belonged to last year, we're a little bit above track on the property tax side. But as far as the first remittance that the county has sent us, it is on track, so we're fine.
You're fine. Good.
We won't know until after the second one comes in whether everything's fine.
Okay. Madam Controller, you write the checks, right? Do we know how many city employees make $200,000 or more?
We can find out.
Yeah,
for you,
I've
I
asked
think.
for those stats before. I'd like to look at who makes
I think we've
200 grand
provided it.
or more.
It's on, I mean, we could get it online, we can provide that to you.
Okay, I'd like
It's
to
on-
get that, and then I'd like to ask a question. If we froze whoever makes 200 grand or more, what kind of savings would that create for us? And if we went to those who make 200,000 or more and told them to take a reduction in salary, whatever it is, that we would think would make some sense, what kind of different dynamics could we look at? But I want to look at who makes 200 grand or more. I want to take a look at what we might need to do from those folks who make 200 more in terms of the budget deficit. Secondly, I want to know about a freeze on all salaries of everybody within every mix within our city. If we did a salary freeze, how much savings could we conceivably make if we did a salary freeze? I think at this point we need to look at all of our employees, sworn and civilian, from those two perspectives, over 200 grand and a freeze and where that would go. I'd like to just see some data.
Just a question on the salary freeze. You mean no cost of living adjustments going
All of
forward
that.
or anything else? Any other
Everything
bump?
above whatever they're making now, be it cost of living adjustment, be it union negotiated contract reduction, increases, be it the executive salary scales and how people have moved up the executive salary scale. I just want to get a picture of everybody's paycheck within that context. If there's any opportunities for us to look at that in any kind of a way. When it comes to the reserve fund, you mentioned that. How are we doing with the reserve fund? What kind of monies do we have there, and how far can we deal with that issue?
About 185 million right now.
185 million.
Again, it goes up and down depending upon that we have to borrow from it, and we're allowed to do that during times in which we anticipate revenue coming in for that. So we kind of do a little bit of borrowing. For example, even in the TRAN, 400 million of that TRAN is for us to meet our cash flow obligations. But the reserve fund is 400. I heard her feet. I thought, I said something wrong. So right now it's $185 million.
And that's below the 5% that you've set as a policy in terms of where you like to see the reserve to be.
Yeah. And we also have a ballot measure, don't we?
That would establish, institutionalize the various funds that you have and set a minimum amount for the emergency reserve fund. Yes, correct.
Okay. The DWP business, what do you see us taking in from them?
Well, it's $257 million that they adopted in their last year's budget.
You feel comfortable that that's what we're looking at, pretty much?
Last year, it was
I
in
remember.
January where they only adopted $147 million
Right.
and said they would later on adopt the additional 73.5, which became the bone of contention going forward. So we anticipate they will take action. I believe Miguel and I talked about this the other day, sometime this month. That would give us some indication of them meeting the obligation of that $257 million.
Very good. And I'd just like your opinion, Madam Controller. I know you don't have to make the decision this time around, but the P3 concept of these parking structures. Obviously, I've heard every angle of this, from the 53 million is necessary to keep us going forward to all kinds of don't sell it now, it's a fireside price. We need to keep it, we need to do bonding on it, we need to borrow, we need to mortgage. Do you have an opinion about the P3 issue?
Let me just say, that's going to be in closed session on Wednesday, and I think one of the issues unless the CAO and the CLA has some concern, I think some of those things should be dealt with in closed session as opposed to our opinions and such until we get the information.
I agree with the closed session, but I would like whatever you feel comfortable you're to say in the room.
I think, unfortunately or fortunately, I'm not part of the closed session items, so I don't know all of the outstanding issues. I think what we've said today is that there was an anticipation of balancing the budget with that $53 million, and why the CAO is coming forward saying, if we don't do that, here's what the implications are for that. And a lot depends upon the responses they get from the individuals who are bidding on that and looking at the cost benefit. I mean, that's really, I think, unless you have that, that's difficult to do.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mr. Koretz?
Thank you.
Yeah, actually,
sorry.
the follow-up on that, not the P3 piece, but the idea, which I haven't really heard widely discussed before, of rather than doing the P3 lease deal, having the same kind of revenue stream from a mortgage of the parking structures. Has your office taken a look at that? Has the CEO taken a look at that?
Well, currently in the garages we're talking about, the first call is to defease the debt that currently is on those various garages. We owe about $140 million on the various garages, so they've already been mortgaged to a substantial amount. The SPRF fund is established where there's a pecking order of what gets paid first. And in order to have any flexibility with the revenue that's produced by both the garages and the meters, we must not have any debt on any garages. And so there's our ability to do anything else, either securitize that revenue or find other ways to utilize that ongoing revenue that's coming in, is based on whether or not there's any existing debt on the garages. And like I said, we already owe about 140.
Well, that says a package. How about the individual garages that are not encumbered? How many are there? And how much could that produce just for the garages that aren't?
The debt, the policy, or the directive rather, on the SPRF is for all of outstanding debt. So you can't separate one out. The revenue first that's generated from those garages and the meters, not just the garages, has to go for any outstanding debt, whether it's in Pershing Square, which we don't have any, but if it's in Hollywood and Highland specifically, that's the structure in which that was established. So you don't have any flexibility until all of the debt is defeased. I don't know, Jerry, if you want to add to that.
No, that's true. It's governed by the bond indenture, and in essence, all of the revenues from the SPRF are first pledged to the bondholders. So the only way to remove garages from that package without defeasing all of those bonds is to actually go to the bondholders and get their consent, which is a next to impossible and very difficult mechanism to do. So in order to privatize any of the garages, whether it be a lease, which the P3 deal is, or to sell them, we would have to defease the bonds. And that has been the discussion on P3 is, are we going to get enough to defease all the bonds, and how much above that are we going to get, and is it worthwhile to do?
Yeah, I'm still not entirely clear on this. So apart from the P3 deal, we have a certain number of garages that have an outstanding debt. What would stop us from taking a mortgage out on Pershing Square, as an example, which doesn't have a debt, if we weren't doing the P3 deal?
Well, again, there's one garage in the Special Parking Revenue Fund that has debt associated with it, which is Hollywood Highland. There's also debt associated with the First and Alameda property, and it totals about $95 million in the fund. So, like an asset strip to take the value of a garage and borrow against it? Is
Yes.
that what you're?
The bond documents are pretty clear that you cannot use that revenue from that asset to do anything else. So the problem becomes, how do you separate the revenue from the asset? So if you want to borrow again against Hollywood and Highland, or against Broxton or against Cherokee or any of the 9 structures in the P3 proposal, you'd have to do it through the parking fund. And the parking fund is limited on how much debt you can have outstanding. And that's part of the problem, that there's a limit, because the bondholders that currently have bonds don't want you to issue more debt than you have revenue coming in. So we're very limited now what we can do in parking, because it's a small fund. It's not that big of a fund. So that's the problem.
I guess the short answer is that they're already mortgaged. And so in order to take out a second mortgage on the first, we're required to have paid off the first mortgage. And so that's why it's not an option that And so there's been some discussion around securitizing or borrowing against that revenue that comes in, because it's a guaranteed flow of revenue, both from the meters and from the garages, but you can't do that until you no longer owe anything on those garages. And that ties up the meter revenue too. So, we increase the rates and meters, and we put in new technology so that more of them are working. We're seeing an increase in that revenue. That revenue is first committed to pay off the debt on the garages with the debt, with the biggest chunk of it going to Hollywood and Highland. Thank you.
Mr. Weezer? Thank you very much. If no questions of the controller, we can now go to item number 5, and we'll note and file item 6 and go to number 5.
Okay, well, item number 5 is a report that seeks to be responsive to a number of requests made by yourself as chair in this committee to look at alternatives should the P3 not proceed forward.
Let me ask you one thing so that there's some context. Could you take us back a couple of months when the budget started and walk us to where we are now as to the 53 and what it meant? And one of the reason I'm asking that is there was a comment made earlier about implementing the budget that was approved, and I think there is maybe a misunderstanding that if we had implemented that budget, we would have started laying off about 1,000 people around October. And so would you kind of take us from there as to how this fit in context with this budget, and then why we're where we are, and why your recommendations in the sense of an alternative at this time?
Well, I mean, the idea of the P3 even predates my arrival to the city, but was specifically called out in the mayor's proposed budget back in May of last year. And I was just doing a sidebar with Ben to recall what that number was, but it was beyond 60 million from what we remember. There was a significant discussion in your committee as to whether it makes sense to include that. And I think you in particular, Mr. Parks, raised concern about to what extent can we rely on those dollars. And given that there's been significant discussion for now over a year, at the end of the day, the budget that was approved by the council included 53 million of the P3. And that came with the assumption that within the context of that fiscal year, that there would be a long-term lease of those garages, and at minimum, we would have enough to not only mitigate that $53 million hole, but have enough to defease the bonds and have enough for the reserve fund to help us keep the reserve where we want it and help us for next year. And so as a context, we even discussed this as early as several weeks ago in the context of the last financial status report and the operational plans.
Also comment on the October trigger. That's what I'll make sure people are. The October trigger that
the budget included a trigger that stated that should the P3 not be completed by October, that 1,000 layouts would be authorized by the council to proceed forward. That is correct. So in the course of the last several weeks, there's been, today you got a sense of the concerns raised by the community regarding this initiative, and we'll be discussing the particulars of this proposal, like I said, on Wednesday. We wrote the report first with the idea of an alternative, but as we got closer to the beginning of the new calendar year, and we started sort of identifying the likelihood of reaching the kind of dollar target that we hope to achieve, we proceeded to recommend that we start moving forward now, as soon as possible, to address as much of that $53 million problem that was identified in the budget. And so we worked in concert with the CLA and the mayor's office and identified a series of reductions that would generate savings immediately. There's been, if you recall where we were last year, about in the spring, where we saw the rapid decline of our revenue, and we're in a position where we could not cut enough fast enough to be able to mitigate the entire hole that we anticipated that revenue to have. We decided to avoid as much as possible being in the same situation. So what we're proposing before you are a number of reductions that we know, if implemented, will close over 50 million of the gap that we currently have in our budget. The fastest way of closing that gap is through furloughs. The furlough program that the city has certainly had a huge impact on our employees, and even a greater impact on the public in terms of the services that are being curtailed. But it has been effective in reaching our target in terms of the savings that need to be generated. So to ensure that we end the year in the black, we are proposing increasing the number of furlough days across the board by 10 additional days. We have submitted a supplemental report that states that to the extent that a department provides an alternative structural reduction, that those furlough days be phased out and be replaced with another cut. In our supplemental report, we articulate specifically what each department's portion of the 20 million target is, and we give a recommended process where departments could come in and submit an adopt the furlough plan immediately, while at the same time submitting an alternative that would be presented in the mid-year FSR for your final consideration and approval. But until then, the furlough program would be implemented to include those 10 additional days.
Let me just ask, would you explain for the public and those that are here what you mean by structural?
By structural, we mean our savings that we could count on for next year. Furloughs are not a structural solution. They are temporary. We're currently being challenged by labor on furloughs, and unless we intend to make furloughs or unpaid days of a way of life in the city, they should only be considered as a one-time solution. So to the extent in which we identify structural cuts, meaning actual reductions in the size of the workforce, eliminating programs, and other reductions that we could count on next year, furloughs will continue being a one-time fix.
And structural, what impact would they make on the issue of pensions and medical?
What the benefit of a structural cut versus a one-time cut is that to the extent that the workforce is reduced, there are secondary reductions in our costs for pensions and for healthcare costs. The two are the primary drivers behind our growing deficit. Already, the city has made a significant reduction in the workforce. In a period of 18 months, 4,000 positions have been taken off the books by both an early retirement program, by layoffs, and of course the transfer of general fund employees to special fund employees. So we've been able to eliminate those positions and provide a structural change in our outgoing deficits. So that is ultimately the place that we want to be, and we want to be in a place that we have aligned our revenue with our expenditures. This budget that was adopted attempted to do that with a combination of one-time and ongoing cuts. The P3 is a one-time solution for the majority of it, the revenue generated. Perhaps that best case scenario help us out for this year and maybe part next year, depending on how much we get. But it's not a structural change in how we do business. So going back to sort of the number of cuts, what we've tried to present to you are reductions that we know will generate the savings this year, so we end the year in the black. Our biggest concern is that we not adopt any reductions and that we go beyond what our reserve fund can handle by the end of this year. And we talked about earlier the implications of doing that. It essentially makes it much more difficult to borrow the kind of money that we do during good years and bad. If we are successful in borrowing, we'll be borrowing at a much higher rate, and it's likely to trigger a downgrade, which means that we will no longer be able to access certain parts of the markets for the kind of borrowing that we do. And so what the proposal before you seeks to address the deficit that we know of today in two different parts. The most significant being immediate by reducing a number of different programs, expanding the furloughs, and now applying furloughs on certain parts of the city workforce that are currently exempt from furloughs. Then the second phase, should the P3 not materialize or should not hit the target that we believe makes it a worthwhile thing to do, we recommend no longer making the contribution that we had made in the operational plans regarding the EA furloughs, suspend and stop the hiring of police officers for the rest of this year. As well as looking at if we choose not to move forward on the P3, we are recommending that we look at the current structure that we have for our garages, that we look at the rates that we're charging, because what this process has shared with us is that we're charging what we believe are below market rates. We look at the subsidies that we're offering up in Hollywood Highland and in other areas, and adopt a structure that maximizes the use of those particular assets under the city's control, and to generate that revenue that then we could transfer over to the general fund. We provided an estimate of what that could look like. Obviously, it depends on when these rates are adopted, when we stop subsidizing $4 million on an annual basis at Hollywood Highland, and a number of other things, but we're hoping that that will begin the process of treating these assets like an asset and running them much more professionally and more effectively. Those are our recommendations. I don't know if, Jerry, you want to add anything more to that?
Let me just ask another point of clarity. You mentioned earlier that we've eliminated over 4,000 positions in the last 18 months. And is there a number as to of layoffs? Do we know what that number is today?
There's been approximately 400 layoffs so far.
Now, is that included in the 4,000 positions?
That is included. It also includes those who retired early. It also includes individuals who were transferred from the general fund to the special funds, and it includes any vacant funded positions that we were able to keep vacant, and we wiped off the books due to essentially halting most, if not all, civilian hires in the last 18 months.
Okay. And then let me ask you, on your report plus the supplemental report, is that all based on the view that PSR or FSR 1, 2, and the operational plans have all been implemented fully?
That is correct, and that's an important point. You know, the city does a good job in tracking the progress of the budget, and through the leadership of this committee, opens the budget and makes adjustments accordingly through the financial status reports. Each department was required to do that again. The last time was less than 30 days ago. But like anything else, those are plans. You know, it is expected that the targets and the commitments that departments made in the last operational plan that this committee and the full council adopted will be fully implemented. Any deviations from that will obviously make this problem bigger and require further reductions in subsequent FSRs.
Okay. And Jerry, you have anything to add?
No, I think Miguel's covered it. Again, I would stress what Miguel started off with, saying that we're really no longer looking at this as an alternative to P3. These are reductions that are going to have to be made irrespective of whether P3 takes place. Again, we've got a $350 million problem next year, and we need to start addressing that now. These items, even if P3 does occur, would also help to increase the reserve fund. It would help to reduce the amounts of money that would have to be appropriated next year. So 350 is a huge problem to deal with, and we need to get started on it. As we've seen, the sooner the better.
Let me just ask colleagues if you have any questions on the general overview, but I'd like to, after the general questions, that we can go line by line on your attachment 1, so we can have discussion on each one of the recommendations, and at the same time compare it with your supplemental attachment 1. So let's see if there's any. Jose, you have any questions?
Yes. Mr. Santana, you mentioned that furloughs are used as temporary measures to alleviate some reductions we have to make. At the same time, we have some temporary money from the federal government, stimulus money, the ARRA money, whatever you want to call it, that is temporary money. And there was a report recently done by our controller mentioning that we have not expended about 75% of those dollars. I know that the school district actually used a lot of its stimulus money to save jobs, to keep more teachers in the classroom. Have we looked at, or is it possible for us, even despite the actions we've taken in the last budget, to now re-look at that and say, you know, how many of these projects that we've allocated some of the stimulus money to, are they ready? Will they be ready to go? Are we going to lose some of that money? Should we not use it? Can we do a re-examination of that and perhaps use some of that stimulus money instead of the additional furloughs you're proposing?
Well, you're correct in that the report demonstrated that we hadn't fully utilized that revenue. We believe we're on track at using all of it. We don't expect any of it to be returned back to the federal government. The challenge here is that much of that revenue is earmarked for specific contracts. If the overarching sort of thought behind the stimulus, that it was supposed to generate private sector jobs. The city has done everything it can to take those dollars and incorporate within our own city family. More specifically in the area of street services. We were able to spend the dollars quicker actually than other jurisdictions because we have a workforce in place that does much of the street services work that other cities contract out. And so as a result, we've been able to utilize, and a significant portion of the work that is done in street services is now being completed by a workforce that otherwise would have been impacted, furloughed further, or even laid off had those dollars not been there. The challenge is that we've gotten a lot of pushback actually from the federal government for doing that, and we went through a period of 1.5 years of negotiating with them and the state regarding the use of our own workforce for those dollars, and at the end of the day reached a verdict that states that we could go ahead and do that for this year, but that we shouldn't be doing it any time in the future. The rest of those dollars, there's a sizable portion that's going to maintain the police workforce, and it's being, there's portions of it that are salt and pepper throughout the city. Unfortunately, it does not act as a replacement for the plan that you have before you. I wish it could. I wish we could transfer those dollars and help fill in this gap. And unfortunately, that's not something that we can do.
Okay, so in that, now we have we keep stating that as a city, public safety is a priority, along with core services. But I do think we have the choice, if we re-examine how we have allocated our stimulus dollars, to say, well, we may, we've allocated to do, these projects, these public infrastructure projects for the future, because we think they're shovel-ready, and these are our projects, that's what we reported to the federal government. But if we're now saying core services, providing core services to our constituents is a priority, why not forego some of those projects that we've allocated money to and say we're going to put the stimulus money there? But let's get back to filling potholes, taking tree limbs off our roads, and provide some of those core services that we've been providing in the past. So, for example, we've in the past been able to fill potholes in 48 hours. We did this Operation Pothole this weekend, but in fact, if we get more of our workers off furloughs, we could go back to provide some of those more basic core services. Now, that is a choice for the council to make, correct?
Well, to the extent that the dollars allow you to do that, the strings attached to those dollars. And again, I tout street services as an example of a department that has actually figured out how to maximize the federal stimulus dollars to do the work that they're doing. The issue with street services, and I don't know if they're here today, maybe to speak specifically to this issue, is their ability to isolate those dollars exclusively. In other words, to maintain a workforce that's 100% funded out of street services dollars. And so they basically have spread those dollars across the board to ensure that they are able to maintain as many of the jobs as possible. So there isn't one body of employees whose sole funding source is stimulus or special fund departments. Most employees have a blend of both special funds and general funds, and that is why they're being impacted by furloughs. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Good afternoon. John Chavez with the CAO's office. Our CAO is correct. Street Services does not just have pothole people exclusively devoted to pothole services. Someone doing pothole repairs today in the afternoon, they could be cleaning up debris out in an alleyway. Tomorrow, they could be doing...
Got it, but it's a core service nonetheless.
Right.
Well, all this to say, my point being is that instead of us going down a further path of more furloughs that does not allow us to provide those basic services, those core services that this council has often said is a priority, we should re-examine the list of projects that we have already allocated stimulus dollars to and say, 1 year is a long time. I've seen a lot of projects lose their timelines, lose their, budgets, and they're not going forward. We should re-examine what we're doing currently with those stimulus dollars to see if, in fact, we could now bring in some of those dollars back to provide for some of those core services, whichever way we do it, whether it's for materials that we need, whether it's getting people off furloughs, whatever it is. And we should look at re-examining where we have allocated those stimulus dollars to in the past fiscal year.
I would say, Councilman, alternatively, we could look at, if not our dollars, we could look at gas tax, for instance, to dedicate, maybe not specifically we can dedicate it perhaps for individuals that could work one day on pothole repair to provide that level of service. But there are other funding sources. I mean, Street Services has 11 that could be used for pothole repair. It's a matter of really discussing and talking this through with the department.
I mean, the challenge here is, also making sure that it's permissible under the strings that are attached with those dollars. But I think we'll work with the department to do that. In so doing, the other consequence of that, though, if you isolate a workforce that is now almost exclusively funded from the general fund, then they will then experience the greatest brunt of layoffs and of a significant number of furlough days. I think what Mr. Robertson was trying to do was, to the extent that was permissible within the rules of the grant, spread it out so that everyone benefited, which meant that everyone had to experience some level of furlough. So there's a trade-off associated with isolating the workforce. But I think as an overarching issue that we're really grappling now. If you look at the issue of graffiti, for example, I'm a big believer that graffiti is a core service. That's something that every constituent believes they should have. They should have, when they drive down their neighborhoods, they should not see graffiti, and it's absolutely a public safety issue. We're now at a point where we're discussing what core services are we maintaining. It's not about saying we're cutting out the fat in the city or things that are perhaps not as important. When you don't reduce the workforce by 10% in a significant way through positions and then again through furloughs and basically leave any fat left. Now it's about discussing how do we prioritize within the context of those things that are important to do in core and and look at alternative ways of doing it. And the graffiti as an example, you know, it's not the elimination of the program, it's half of the year. So it's really a quarter, but the impact is significant because it's being applied in half a year. But forcing ourselves to start looking at alternative ways of doing those same functions so that we still get to the same goal, but perhaps just still generate the savings. And I think as we proceed forward, not only today, but for the rest of this year for reductions, I would be surprised if there's anything that's on the table that someone will argue, well, that's not a core service. Everything now that we're talking about is about the core, unfortunately.
Well, I never got the sense in the last fiscal year discussion, budget deliberations, that we all agreed upon what is a core service. I think we still have to determine that, and the council still has very different ideas about what core services are. But secondly, my point being that we should go through an exercise looking at where we've allocated or earmarked our stimulus dollars to see if in fact those projects are moving forward or not, see if we could put some of those funds in our core service work, however we define that, to alleviate the general fund pressures that we have. It's just an exercise we should do, even if we didn't have these budgetary cuts we have to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weezer. Mr. Parks had to step out for a minute. I'll be chair for a few minutes, and I have to step out for a conference call at 3. But a couple things I wanted to just put on the record. For you, first of all, Miguel, you weren't here at the time, but I was the lone vote against P3 when it was first brought up. And Mr. Parks immediately saw the argument and joined with me, and now it became a crescendo, and at one point the council actually turned the whole thing down, and then a majority of the council got kind of weak-kneed on this whole thing. You said something I want to correct, and you said the council could not cut enough fast enough. That's wrong. Council could, it didn't. And I think the problem we're in today is not the mayor's fault. He proposed an idea. We had a choice to turn it down or not turn it down. But the council's inaction and inappropriate actions is what put us in this hole today. It was the council that couldn't decide what it's going to do, which has been a problem in this council for the last year. They can't make up their mind and do whatever they need to do. And they push us into a corner now where we have to choose between a really crummy proposal or a really worse proposal. I used different words last time in the council. But the problem is it's been exasperated. And as we're looking at what you proposed, and I think Mr. Weezer stepped on it just briefly, didn't step on it, brought it forward, is that these are policy decisions we have to make. And what I'm really upset about is you brought forward a plan and said, here's the dollar amounts and here's what you need to do. I wish you had brought forward to us a much larger menu of options, because we are the ones that have to make the decision on what core functions are. To you, graffiti may be. To me, it may be. But for a majority, that's the question. And I wish we had a large menu so we could really sit and look at what the availability is and how easy it is to get, and then what the dollar value of each of those are to solve for the equation, which is you need to solve for this equation by July 1 of this year, and for next year, what's the value of it? And I wish it was done in that proposal, because I think it's unfair what you've brought forward. And you know, Miguel, I have great respect for you. But I don't have respect for what this council and the city is doing to our employees. You can't tell them one day, we're going to give you 10 furlough days, and the next day 13, the next day 26, now 36. Say to them, we want a 10% kickback on your salary. We keep treating our employees like serfs, and I am tired of treating them like that. It is wrong, it is inhumane, and we've got to just make up our mind and have the guts in this council to do our job and go forward whatever it takes to survive as a city and quit treating our employees like trash. It is wrong. Let's, and I'm saying this to my colleagues and in the press, and everyone wants to hear it, let's just make a decision and stick to it and go forward and quit playing these games, because it is hurting too many people, and it is wrong. So I will not vote for any proposal that has furloughs or increase of furloughs in it. I'm sick and tired of furloughs. It's got to stop. It's inhumane. Secondly, I am not going to vote for P3 unless all the parking lots are in it. We can't pick this apart until there's a skeleton left and expect to go out and sell it to the marketplace. They won't buy it. We've got to go back to where we were with P3. And as much as I hate P3 and as much as I think it is wrong, the only way I'll vote for it is if the council has the guts to determine that if they don't do it, these are what the core services are, and the rest is going to go by the wayside. And so if public safety is number one, then let's fund public safety. And what is public safety? That's yet to be determined. But we've got to quit this game. I don't know how we got here, quite frankly. It's this incremental weekly discussion we go through every single week, trying to look inside ourselves and what's morally right and what's morally wrong. And there's no consistency. And we look like fools to the people of this city, and we look like fools to our union friends and our employees. And it's time to just pick a plan and stick to it. So I wish you would come back with a much larger spectrum of options, and let us hopefully have the guts to make the decisions and do the right thing. That's what I hope from all this.
Yeah, I know Mr. Koretz wants to speak as well, but let me make a couple of comments as well. I do not want to support any furloughs or layoffs going forward. I think we've reached that point, and we need to put, as Mr. Smith says, more options in front of us on the table. For instance, anecdotally, I've talked to a general manager who said, instead of increasing my furlough days, let me manage what the expectations are out of my department. And let me make a proposal that would work. So I'm going to listen to that general manager's proposals. Frankly, layoffs and furloughs are not the solution. When it comes to public safety, I've been one of the very strong believers in to hire to attrition. But as I said in a public forum with the chief of police, it's his challenge to scrub his numbers and come up with fundings in other ways. I frankly don't believe overtime is an automatic paycheck. People need to not just bank it and get it some other day, but they're not going to get paid for overtime because it's either the job kept or overtime with it. And obviously, if I'm a police officer, I have to follow my crime situation to its entirety, and it might be working late one night or this or that. But look, no offense, but I work 24/7. And I think people at the level that are functioning in a city at this point have to look at overtime as a luxury of the past. So I think we need to look at all the overtime aspects. That's why I've also asked you and asked the controller, anybody making over 200 grand a year, I want to know how much it is, who it is, how many people involved. And we need to start freezing our salaries so that we can function as a city. I do not want to give up core services that also include the parks and include the libraries and include the potholes and include having officers on the street, not in a civilian desk job. So I know these are, pretty much what you heard from Mr. Smith as well, but we need more options in front of us to deal with so that we can look at it. Or we need to challenge, as I'm speaking right now, every general manager in the audience, that the task is not the furlough or layoff. How else can we consolidate things and save money? Because it's all about the dollar that's only limited in what it has. And of course, the quicker we hear from the state as how the CRA aspect impacts us, I mean, we need to know, what does that mean in real dollars and cents for us as a city? And I think Jerry Brown appreciates local government, that we are where the rubber hits the road. We're the ones, really, that people come up to all the time about issues. If I have heard it once, I've heard it 1,000 times. Rosendahl, I pay property tax. They have no idea how much of that property tax we, the city, gets and how we have to prioritize its use. The public needs more of an education as to where their tax dollars go. That's why I'm hopeful that the governor will restructure our tax system. I have said to this governor and to the others, there's $5 to $10 billion sitting out there right now where Prop 13 with commercial ventures have never been dealt with, that need to be dealt with. So I'm expecting more leadership out of Jerry Brown on some of those issues, but we do need more options to work with.
Yeah, I have a few questions. One of them is, how much is our shortfall this year a byproduct of general managers overrunning their budget? How much is each department over budget? And if that is a significant factor, how do we generate some real accountability?
Your committee adopted an operational plan that essentially eliminated the shortfall for this year. That was unanticipated. So there was In the last financial status report that we submitted, we demonstrated which departments were behind schedule in their implementation of their budget. They were asked to put together an operational plan, and your committee adopted it. So the amount that we're talking about today is a shortfall that we've known we've had all along. We continue to have a plan to mitigate it. Unfortunately, because of a number of reasons, we believe we should move forward in addressing it now. There was one, with the exception of one, the $9 million that was a result of a payout for PPL as a result of our labor agreement. Everybody else's shortfall has been 100% mitigated so far.
As far as the difficulties with the federal government in loosening up the purse strings, I know we discussed this in AGE. Have we looked at adding to our legislative package an effort to work with the federal government to have them loosen their guidelines?
We start off from the very beginning trying to have as few strings attached to every federal dollar or state dollar that we get. And the pushback that we get is always that if we do it for Los Angeles, we have to do it for everybody else. We're going to report back, based on Mr. Weezar's motion, how we can further maximize that flexibility, and should there be any rule change or legislative relief to try to use those dollars to further prevent additional furloughs and cuts like these, we will pursue those. The challenge is, of course, that, a legislative fix takes time, especially in Congress. It's now divided. That won't happen overnight. It would be virtually impossible to get that done to provide us relief this fiscal year, but it doesn't mean that it's not worth pursuing.
So have we given direction to our legislative people in Washington to make that part of our legislative package, not only seeking it for LA, but I suppose it's a rule change we would seek for everyone.
It's part of the program that our advocates in Washington and Sacramento pursue now.
And do we have the same definition of shovel-ready that the federal government does? Are we operating under the same basis?
But we have to follow their guidelines.
Okay. And on the question I was asking before about mortgaging the garages, have we ever looked at a broader approach of refinancing the entire package and then adding in some additional funding? So if we could start from scratch, pay it all off, and refinance it more to the tune of 190 or 200 million.
We would have to look in whether it generates enough revenue to be able to do that. It doesn't produce $140 million worth of revenue to be able to defease those bonds that would then allow you flexibility in how you spend those dollars, or flexibility to mortgage them again. One of the reasons why we recommend moving forward with the P3 initially was because it gives us the flexibility to securitize that potential revenue that we get now. If we no longer have that debt on these various garages, then we would then have flexibility of how we can maximize that revenue. Today, we're limited by our commitment to the bondholders that any dollar that goes first will go first to pay off that debt. And so that's really what the challenge is that we're limited by the structure of how these various garages are financed to be able to maximize that revenue today.
But we have a clear revenue stream from these garages, so I don't understand if there's projected enough income for someone to want to lease it over 50 years, what's to stop us from refinancing it and mortgaging that over the same period of time, using the same revenue stream that they'd be looking at to make a profit?
It's our agreement with the bondholders that makes it a challenge.
So what I don't understand is if we refinanced it based on the revenue stream.
Well, I'll give you an example.
And borrowed $190 million and paid off the bondholders $140 million, I don't understand why that doesn't work.
It's hard to make that case when we're currently subsidizing even some of the garages that are in debt. Currently, Hollywood and Highland, for example, we are currently paying an additional $500,000 a year beyond what it generates in revenue, because it doesn't generate enough revenue to take care of even the debt that's issued in Hollywood and Highland. So just take that garage itself, which carries the biggest chunk of the debt that our garages have. Today, it doesn't produce enough revenue to cover 100% of the debt on an annual basis. It used to be a lot more. It used to be in the millions, the subsidy. Now we've been cut in half to only $500,000. But we're still subsidizing that garage by $500,000 a year to cover our annual debt service on that garage.
The way that we issue, just to further clarify, the way that you issue bonds for parking is that you look at the amount of revenue you bring in on the entire parking system, which includes lots, garages, and meters, and then you calculate how much debt that supports. And based on our most recent calculations, you don't have enough coverage to issue an additional $100 million. So you'd have to pay off the 95, and then to issue an additional 100, and then an additional 100 on top of that. You couldn't. There's not enough value in the revenue itself to allow for that. And that's the type of analysis that we do. On top of that, parking is only A-rated. It's not a highly rated debt, because the rating agencies understand and investors understand that parking lots don't pay for themselves. That's why the public sector does them. The private sector, the reason we paid for Hollywood and Highland is because they don't pencil out. The operation, the maintenance, and the debt, there's not enough revenue to cover for it. So what ends up happening is the rest of the system, the lots that are not funded by debt, and the meters end up subsidizing the parking garages. They just don't pencil out. That's why you have the CRA and the city investing in these types of garages.
But then, we are assuming it's profitable for private operators. Is part of that because they're willing to charge higher rates that we as a city wouldn't be willing to charge?
It's also efficiencies. I mean, their issue right now is not the rates. It's efficiencies and how they operate the lots and economies of scale. They are not, and it's automation. Most of the private lots are completely automated. That's one way they make money. The other one is economies of scale. These are parking operators that own parking lots, if not throughout the city, throughout the country. So they have found mechanisms to make money. You control parking rates. You will always control parking rates by state law. You have to. So it's not so much how much they charge, is how they keep up the lots and making people want to come and park there.
And it's a number of things. It's the marketing of the lots, it's establishing, relationships with the surrounding businesses, it's the management of them, it's the investment of the lots on an ongoing basis, it's the fluctuation of the rates based on demand, so you have demand pace, and it is the rates. I mean, one of the challenges is by keeping Westwood free, then obviously that makes a challenge as to how much revenue a private operator could count on, or significantly subsidizing Hollywood and Highland from $6 to $2. Right now, the city pays that subsidy. We lose that revenue on an annual basis of $4 million. So, but the flexibility, that's sort of goes to the heart as to why we're recommending moving forward, is that the more challenges that are placed, the same questions that you're asking about, why can't we maximize it as an asset, generate enough revenue to pay off debt, which a private operator would have to do to write us a big check at the beginning, are the same issues that they're grappling with. And so it's for that reason that we're recommending moving forward on the cuts, because we cannot guarantee, we've now tipped over to the other side, where the likelihood that we're going to get the revenue that we want is getting smaller and smaller. So we need to then move quickly so that we don't end the year in the red.
Okay, and I know we're only looking at furloughs. Are we again re-examining city contracts and which ones could be eliminated as well?
Well, that's part of the action that we did this year, and as part of mitigating the deficit for this year. We already did an across-the-board look at all contracts required at minimum a 10% reduction. And I think as we move forward to address the $350 million deficit we're facing next year, the question is which contracts do we have to eliminate altogether?
But is there a reason why we're only looking at furloughs and not looking at eliminating some of those contracts now as well?
Which contracts would you like us to eliminate?
Oh, I don't have specific proposals. I'm asking whether we've done a run-through, and rather than just saying, okay, we can cut X number of city-provided services, why are we not, or are we not looking a second time at which contracts are least vital?
And that goes to our second supplemental memo, that we're asking departments that if they would like to eliminate furloughs, that they provide an alternative reduction, and contracts would be a good place to start, to come to the table and provide recommendations to eliminate those contracts.
I would agree, and that's the point I'm making.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So you have any questions? Let me just clarify a couple of things. And when we had this discussion before on dealing with contracts, if we eliminated X dollars worth, it's sustainable over time that we don't return them. But on the other hand, have we considered what services that will not be forthcoming, and how much impact those contracts would have on our pension and our medical? In the sense of, as you mentioned earlier, looking for sustainable cuts.
Right. I mean, that's the other side of the coin. The reason why a contract, there's a value to a contract, and that one, it could be cut in a faster rate, and that the contract doesn't add to your pension and your health care costs, which are one of the primary drivers behind our deficit. So if we go into a context where we basically eliminate all contracts, we're basically creating a situation where we're relying exclusively on a workforce that has a significant pension and health care burden.
And then also on contracts, are there any contracts let by the city that does not go through the charter requirement for assessing whether it is a financially viable to go with a contract versus city employees?
Not that I know of. They all have to go through that process, that's correct.
They all have to go through, what is it, 1022 or?
That's right.
Okay, so in order for a contract to be issued, it had to be validated by, I believe, the CAO's office.
That's correct.
That is more cost effective to do it with a contract than with city employees.
That's right.
Okay, all right. Let me ask if we can kind of walk through both of your attachment ones as it relates to what the recommendation, so we can get any questions and insights as it relates to each item.
Ben Sahel with the CEO's office. If you refer to attachment 1 of the original report, it starts off with the item that's been discussed here, and that's the additional 10 furlough days for civilian employees. And to note, these would be general funded positions, with the exception of EAA employees. That dollar amount is $20 million. Attachment number 1 to the supplemental report is tied to this first recommendation. So in the supplemental report, we identified what the target for each department would be for those additional furlough days, and also made the recommendation that if departments would like to not have furloughs be one of their solutions, for them to propose permanent reductions to be considered by the City Council in the mid-year FSR.
Okay. And also, I think has to be clear that if on attachment 1 of the original report, if there are no cuts forthcoming, then we get out of this year saving money, but then how does that impact next year's deficit if there's no structural change this year? If there are no recommendations for structural change from the departments on this item number 1, the first item for the furloughs, and we get through the year and we achieve the $20 million furloughs, where does that put us next year's
it puts you with that same problem. I mean, so the options would be, as part of the budget process, is to identify permanent ongoing reductions that will likely result in layoffs, or deciding to attach those 10 additional days as part of next year's budget. So those would be the options that the council would have.
Okay, and this proposal today on your recommendations of the original report, if we go back to this year's budget, what was proposed was $53 million worth of layoffs. You've altered that by recommending furloughs to reach 20 million, and then another 30-plus million in other ways to close that gap.
Yes. That is correct, and the reason why we're recommending that is that until there is a majority of your council that has made a decision as to what functions we're not doing anymore and start making those reductions, we will be waiting for those savings. And we're not in a situation like we were last year where we could have the reserve fund absorb a significant portion of the deficit. So the question about making cuts is not one that we could avoid. We will have to confront that question in the mid-year financial status report and in the budget. The concern that we had is that there's no consensus today among your council as to what services to eliminate and thus what positions to take off the budget, resulting in layoffs. And so until that consensus is reached, then we have to find an alternative way of making reductions.
Does your attachment 1 of the supplemental at least get started in that direction as it relates to beginning to identify what might be viable cuts in the near future?
That's correct. It gives the departments a process that if they're seeking to eliminate furloughs or phase them out for this fiscal year, then they actually identify the alternative cut, an ongoing cut, that will be included in the mid-year FSR for adoption. So assuming here that we have the mid-year FSR come out in mid-February, last year is probably a good indication of the level of controversy that generated in last year's FSR. It took about 6 weeks to finally have those recommendations adopted, and an additional 6 weeks, 8 weeks to begin the layoff of employees. And so the benefit of the layoffs really helped the budget really for the month of May and June. And so if we relied exclusively on that process, we know we would then deplete the reserve fund. And so that is why we're recommending doing both things concurrent, adopting additional one-time cuts and proceed with the process by having each department come up with alternatives, using the mid-year FSR and the budget for ongoing structural cuts.
And also on your supplemental attachment 1, if departments came up with structural changes that are represented on this chart, then that would eliminate the 10 days additional, not the 26.
That is correct. It would eliminate it. And it's important to point out that obviously 20 million, while is a significant number, is still a long way from 350 million. So the reality is that for most of the departments, the amount that's sort of enumerated in this chart in the second supplementary report, it's only a fraction of what their overall cut will likely be by the end of the fiscal year into next year's budget. So it's a department could come up and say, well, I could come up with, like an aging $26,000 worth of cuts that are ongoing, and so I should be good for next year. Well, that unfortunately is not the case. That means that you'll be able to phase out the furloughs for this year, and we may not have to impose another additional 10 days next year, but every department's reduction is very likely to be much larger than the number that's listed here.
And to the extent that any reductions are made that are structural now, that's going to help some next year. But I think, as Mr. Santana said, that's just the start. This is a first step. There's going to be more that's going to be required in balancing next year's budget.
And the reality is that as painful as these cuts are today, they pale in comparison to the kind of cuts you will be considering in a few months, and in order to be able to make it through next year. These are minor in comparison to the tsunami that's coming. And so while we all want a situation where there's no layoffs and no furloughs, the reality is that's almost an impossible ask. It's hard for me to imagine any scenario in the next year, within this calendar year, where we have no layoffs and no furloughs.
Okay. Colleagues, on that first item, and I think the city CAO's recommendation is that if we were to approve that we simultaneously approve the increase in the furloughs by 10 days, but also at the same time approve attachment 1, which gives the department general managers a $20 million target as it relates to structural changes. And so those going simultaneously, if we can get any comments or concerns on that.
Yeah, I'd actually propose a substitute for that. I agree with my colleague, Mr. Smith, that we've hammered our employees enough already with 26 furlough days. And we're talking about a pretty random cut in services. I would suggest if we're going to be that random, that we just require $20 million in cuts to contracts. We'll lose some services. We're going to lose services anyway. I think we've hammered our people enough, and I think we could take that $20 million and spread it over all our contracts without doing any greater damage than with these additional furloughs. So I would recommend that as a substitute to fill that $20 million hole.
Let me just ask, if we have a city attorney here? Could you give us just a tad of advice? What is the process if we're in the middle of a contract and if we cut contracts outside of the guidelines of the contract, and just what impact that makes on the city?
Well, very likely the city would be in breach at that point in time. And
Talking to Mike.
Oh. Valentin Dino, City Attorney's Office. If the contract is cut unilaterally, the city obviously would be in breach, and then the vendor would seek whatever remedies are available to the vendor under the contract and under applicable law.
Okay, so you're saying it could be litigation?
Almost certainly.
On this, we could certainly, Mr. Koretz, add that as an option, but I think one of the things that if it creates litigation or other things that may delay the process and not create the revenue, then we've not reached, or at least confronted the challenges we have.
What I would recommend is that, sort of as a compromise, is that in the alternative cuts that departments are being asked to consider, that they be encouraged to go through all their contracts, determine which ones have a termination clause that allows us to terminate out of convenience, which many of them do, and provide that for council consideration, so you know which services you're no longer producing. But the concern with doing that in place of the furloughs is the certainty, is that that process will take time. And even if departments move quickly, that it's the likelihood of hitting that $20 million target by the end of this year is a challenge. So that's why we created the second supplemental report, is to create a process to encourage departments to come up with an alternative way, and that would allow that to happen. And contracts would be one of the first places I would go as a general manager to determine which contracts are necessary and which ones are not, which ones have the ability to contract eliminate within 30 days, which ones don't, that kind of thing.
If I could get a microphone, there we go. If I could just make the counter argument, number one, our employees say we're in breach already and we're in court, so there's no certainty on these furloughs anyway. And I don't know that we've done any due diligence on the contracts and that we have a sense yet of how many of them we could terminate in a short period of time and how many of them we'd have a legal battle over. So I'm not sure I feel any more confident that adding 10 furlough days isn't just adding that number of dollars to the hole that we could potentially lose if we lose this case in court. I think there's almost more certainty by doing it with the contracts if we find enough contracts that we could terminate in a timely fashion.
Let me ask, on the contracts, is it the CAO's position in looking at them that if terminated, the city would not reassume those services, that whatever services that are cut would no longer be done?
Otherwise, there wouldn't be a savings. I mean, if the contract then, that function now gets shifted over to the city, then you're obviously creating added responsibility and added cost, and oftentimes at a more expensive cost. So we're basically eliminating a contract. For me, what that means is you eliminate that function altogether.
Right. And are the contracts we're discussing, are most of those contracts are being let through general services, or are these contracts that are directly the departments actually implement?
Each department has its own series of contracts that, you know, that at some point they determined it was more cost effective to contract out, or they didn't have the internal capacity or expertise to do it. That's why they're doing the contracting in the first place.
So they would have to, if we followed with the recommendation of Mr. Koretz, they would have to go through these contracts themselves and determine which are viable, which has the language in it, and things of that nature. And so would, in the sense of a general statement of just eliminating $20 million of contracts, we would not, at this point in this committee, be able to judge just what departments would have that belief that they can cut contracts, or whether they find other alternatives.
That is correct. I think the recommendation requesting the departments identify contract eliminations as the first alternative to furloughs, I think that's a smart way to go. It's my concern is waiting until that gets done, and the period of overlap becomes such where the likelihood of not meeting that target is higher. That would be my only concern. Okay. But doing that exercise, I think, is very important. I think that is definitely something that should be included as part of this report.
And then also, in the sense of timing, the reason of the urgencies, we have, 6 months left in the fiscal year to at least clarify and rectify this year's budget before we get into next year's shortfalls.
That is correct.
Okay. Mr. Koretz, could we...
5 months.
Maybe I could suggest something that's sort of a middle ground. What if we looked at this as finding $20 million in contracts to cut and allow the other choices to be the alternatives? That you cut the contracts first, and if you can't find a way to do it, then you look at other choices like furloughs, rather than vice versa.
Well, I think you could do that. I think the dilemma that you run into is that you can cut contracts and not deal with structural change, particularly as it relates to pension. So whatever way...
As long as you don't replace the service. When you cut the contract, you're cutting the service. You've made a significant structural change if you're not reviving it next year.
But also remember, this council, when they found out recently we cut a service such as a median repair and maintenance, immediately we had a firestorm of finding money to fix those. And so it will all depend on when those departments come back and tell us what contracts that they believe should be cut. And I'm sure council members will all have some say as to whether they believe those are the right priorities.
Well, a good example is the graffiti. The reduction in graffiti is all contracts. So that's...
Well, Mr. Chair, that's precisely how I feel about all these proposals, because I really don't get the sense of what the service impact is for a lot of these proposals. I wasn't sure if you were proposing to take action on these items today, because I certainly have a lot more questions about many of these items. For me, I'd rather be in a situation where, let's hear what happens on council on Wednesday with the P3, and I know we're going to have to make a lot of these cuts, but I'm in a situation today that I'd like to know whether we are going to have that $53 million hole or not, even more so. And secondly, get more information on a lot of these proposals. For example, the planning department, that's a reduction that says here that it's going to be for community plans, but I'm being told that it's probably going to encompass more work than just that. The cuts to the fire department, I really want to hear what that means, and we have a few lines here. I'm of the opinion, I'm not ready to go forward with these today. I know we're going to have to do some of this at some time. I need a lot more information on a lot of these items.
Our intent is to go line by line so that we can get additional information today for the committee.
I see.
But item one, what we're trying to get is the $20 million issue that deals with 10 extra furlough days that go hand in hand with the attachment one of the supplemental, which could be structural cuts to replace it, or as Mr. Koretz has recommended, could be contracts that add to that structural cut, at least for that year. So that's what we're trying to get line by line to flush it out so we can give the council the options that they may find reasonable. And so, but we intend to go through each one of these so that we get the questions that we can ask so that we have a better balance so that the council can take action.
Okay.
Okay, but on what? So if we can, Mr. Koretz, can we agree on the wording in the sense of that we sent to the council the recommendation on the 10 extra furlough days, that the recommendation of the supplemental report that talks about structural cuts to replace it, and that we add your concern as it relates to, in that mix, that contracts be certainly a priority in considering these proposals for supplemental number one?
I would still prefer that we look at the contracts first and the wording. And with the furloughs, we don't have any sense of what services are being cut, so we don't have a good way to compare them to the contract services that will be cut. But either way, I'm sure they'll be somewhat random. They'll be somewhat problematic, I'm sure, to our constituency, and I'm sure we'll find things that generate more outcry than others. But certainly, if we think it requires a lot of analysis on the contract side, I don't know why we wouldn't have that same expectation on the furlough side.
Well, I think if you look at page 3 of the supplemental, it talks about this is not does not have any financial impact, that everything that's being recommended is going to come back as it relates to the structural changes that can be replaced. So the council will get a thorough review of what's being proposed, and that also would include contracts. I think the issue of the furloughs, or what's being discussed, if I understand the CAO, if you don't move forward on recovering revenue as quickly as possible, then you're now pushing at least $20 million further into the fiscal year, where a month from now it could be significantly higher than the $20 million.
If I may offer up a recommendation to mitigate some of the concerns about the unknown impact of the furloughs. Our report recommends implementing furloughs on pay period 17, which is on January 30th. We've already had initial meetings with general managers to bring an appreciation of what that means to each individual department. Also, how we would apply them citywide so that there would be a minimal impact to the operations. What may make sense is that we come back prior to the 30th of this month with a specific report on how those furloughs would be implemented and the service impact of those furloughs, so that you know that prior to the implementation of them starting January 30th.
Okay. And in that report, we could have what the impact would be on the furloughs, what the impact hopefully would be on the contracts, and whether there's been any proposals for the the structural changes.
That's correct.
So if we can get that before the 30th to satisfy all of those concerns, I think we can move forward on item 1.
And if I could just add, personally, my greatest concern is furloughing firefighters, so if we could have a special eye towards trying to mitigate and avoid that.
Yeah, we're going to get to that item. So we can agree on that item. The next one would be general services.
On that item. What'd you say? I'm a register a no vote on that item.
We're not voting
And
yet.
I'll do the same.
Yeah. We're just trying to get some recommendations, and then we can vote on them. Okay? Let's go to item 2. We fleshed out item 1, then we can vote on it, but item 2 deals with general services, police. And one of the things I'd like you to explain, over the last couple of years, we've asked that general services police be dealt with similarly as other law enforcement police officers in the city, and we're departing from that, and just get an explanation on that.
Well, the idea here is that as a way of implementing the furloughs, it is highly likely that we will recommend closing as much of city government as possible, at least 1, if not 2 days during the pay period. So either every other Friday or perhaps every Friday. We're working on that. As a result, the GSD police officers are responsible for the safety of many public buildings, and so there would be obviously a corresponding reduction in the need of services at that time. So that was thinking behind that particular item.
Okay. Colleagues, any questions on item 2 on the general services police? Okay. Let's go to item 3.
Item 3 on the attachment is implementing 10 furlough days for fire special duty positions, also to coincide with additional furlough days for civilian employees. Again, using the same logic that Mr. Santana presented for GSC police officers, if there is those citywide shutdowns with minimal civilian staff, if any civilian staff are working, those individual firefighters who are doing desk jobs could also participate in that same program.
Okay. And then explain to myself and others what the fire special duty positions are.
Some of these include inspectors, those that go out to the field to do inspections of facilities. And there are others currently don't. I'm not sure of.
Let me just ask the fire command if they're here. Could they come up and comment on that? Thank God. Chief, how are you doing?
Very good, sir.
Could you comment on, and I don't, could you share, Karen, item 3 and 4 that the chief can comment, one dealing with the special duty positions and the other one dealing with the $10 million deficit? Could you give us an explanation of what those special duty positions are?
Special duty positions are essentially sworn personnel that work a 40-hour work week. The majority of them are either chief officers or fire inspectors. We have our professional standards division that conducts all of our internal affairs work. They're all on special duty. The fire inspectors are doing fire life safety inspections. They inspect public assemblage, occupancies, nightclubs. They oversee various special events such as the Academy Awards, all those types of things. And so what they do is they facilitate a lot of the business activities that take place in the city and make sure that everyone is safe. And it's primarily one of the reasons that Los Angeles is one of the safest large cities in America. I mean, you look at our fire loss last year, a city of 4 million people, we only had 17 people that died in fires last year. That's an incredible number, and I don't think you can find another large city in the United States that can boast those kinds of statistics, and it's because of these sworn personnel. So you're talking about everyone from the fire chief on down would be, I too would be considered, even though I'm an exempt employee, a special duty sworn member of the department, even though I'm already furloughed.
Okay. Let me just ask on item number 4 that deals with the $10 million deficit.
Well, that's going to be a challenge. Obviously, on January 2nd, we expanded the modified coverage plan from 15 fire companies to 22 fire companies. This was basically as part of our agreed operational plan to bridge that $20.8 million deficit that we had, and our goal was to try and come up with $10 million in savings. So we now have 14 engine companies and 8 light forces closed every day for a grand total of 122 firefighters. So every day, I'm ending up right now with somewhere between 3 to 6 excess sworn members in fire stations because I don't have the seats to put them in. So the likelihood of us being able to expand the modified coverage plan, we've already expanded it to the max, and we're not going to be able to expand it any further to make this happen.
Okay. Let me just ask the CAO, is this proposed $10 million above what the fire department has talked about on the expanded MCP?
That is correct. It's $10 million above what has already been implemented by the fire department beginning this calendar year.
Okay. Is this also above the shortfalls that we saw in the operational report in FSR2?
No, this $10 million is the $10 million that was identified in the operational plan.
So it's the same as the operational plan?
Yes.
Okay. Now, Chief, you said it'd be difficult. What is there a portion of the $10 million that you think the department will be able to resolve, or you're saying that this is beyond the capabilities of the department?
If this is the original $10 million that we were asked to save in our operational plan, we're on track to bridge that gap.
If I could just make a clarification. There was a $20 million deficit identified for the department. Their operational plan and the subsequent implementation of their expanded modified coverage is taking care of half of that, $10 million. So this remaining $10 million is the remainder of that original $20 million deficit.
Okay. So, Chief, your plan is dealing with half, because as you mentioned, modified staffing was going to deal with what you believe was $10 million.
Right.
Okay, this is a $10 million above that.
This is 10 above that, right.
Okay. Any questions?
No, I apologize for just walking in. So now we're saying to Chief Peaks, change the number again? Is that what we're saying, Mr. CAO?
What we're saying is that you had a $20 million deficit. You had proposed...
At the beginning of the year?
No, not at the beginning.
plan.
The operational plan.
The operational plan.
The one you just approved several weeks ago. Had a $20 million deficit in the department. The department came up with a plan to deal with half of it.
Right.
The other half was going to be dealt with by the rest of the general fund. We're saying we no longer can take 100% of that, so now the department's going to have to mitigate 100% of that shortfall.
So Chief Peaks is now being told a couple weeks later to add $10 million to his problem.
That is correct.
How do you expect a general manager, regardless, forget it's Chief Peaks, any general manager, to continually have a different target, probably 7 or 8 times during the past 7 months? How do you expect a general manager to do that? I mean, realistically, forget it's Peaks. It could be Peaks, Beck, Muckery. I don't care who it is. How do you give a general manager 7 different targets in 7 different months and expect them to manage that and get to solve the problem for their department? How do you do that?
As a general manager, I could tell you it's very difficult. I mean...
Difficult? It's impossible.
Well, I mean, my staff is not exempt from any of these cuts or furloughs as well, and we have to implement them in the same way that everybody else does.
No, but he's had it different. I mean, we've told our general managers on 2 or 3 occasions, change your targets, 2 or 3 occasions. This guy gets it every month, and from the mayor, from us, nobody can do that. And I said this publicly, and I'll say it again. This chief is suffering from the inability of a mayor to figure out what his plan is, and for the council to figure out what their plan is, and for the CAO to figure out. This guy is in between 3 people pulling in different directions, and every month it's a different pull in a different direction. No general manager can do that. And you sit there and shake your head.
Well, I don't know what the, absent finding $10 million somewhere else, I don't know what the alternative is. And that's just an honest answer. I mean, the only other alternative is to find $10 million somewhere else to cut.
This is the P, if I can clear Mr. Smith's point on this, this is if we don't go forward with the P3, or am I wrong?
No, because we are concerned about the likelihood of reaching the value of the P3, we are recommending that we cannot wait until the end of this process to determine whether or not we have enough, whether or not we get that revenue. We have to proceed now in ensuring that we have a reserve fund left before the fiscal year's out. To mitigate all the concerns raised by the community in Westwood and in Hollywood and a number of other downtown, all of those concerns, while very valid, decrease the value of that concession. And so we originally had an idea of what we were going to get from that concession. We can no longer make that commitment. And so it is too risky to wait until this process is completed for that revenue to determine whether we hit our revenue target. We are now recommending moving forward now to ensure that we don't eliminate the reserve fund altogether by not making any cuts today.
And also, Miguel, you may mention, the reason for this report today is the request of this committee?
I believe so.
Yeah. So that we asked to tell, so we can advise the council at this late date what condition we're in if P3 is not...
During the last FSR, I believe you made the motion to direct us to come up with an alternative plan.
Okay, all right. Any other questions or comments on the fire?
I just want to apologize to the chief of the fire department for the way he's been treated this year. I think for any general manager, particularly for what you've been put through, I just feel so bad about what the fire department's going through. It's wrong. It's just plain wrong. We got to cut this stuff. The council's got to get some guts around here. I'm sick of it.
I have a process question. This will go to council when?
Wednesday
with the P3. And we haven't taken any action so far. We're just going through each item, correct? And we're going to take one vote at the end? Is that correct?
I didn't hear.
We haven't taken any action on any item. We are just going through them for informational purposes.
That's right.
Then we take one action at the end.
The only action, we've verbally asked the CAO on item 1 to report back on 3 options.
Okay.
Not to approve any of them, but report back before January 30th on 3 options. That's the only thing I'm aware of that we've asked.
Okay, thank you.
And then, let me ask one. Sorry, wait.
I know to try and mitigate this budget, we had some negotiations with our fire union. I don't know that those have come back to council in terms of the results. It sounded somewhat optimistic in that could resolve a chunk of our shortfall. What happened in that process?
I would recommend discussing that in closed session, the status of our labor negotiations. That would be my recommendation. Or I could respond to you in sidebar.
Well, I'd rather have that be a consideration of this body. So maybe when we go into closed session at the end, we could discuss the status of that as well.
Yes.
Okay.
Let me just ask one thing. Could you reconcile on attachment 1 of the original report a $10 million issue for the fire department, but on the attachment 1 of the supplemental, you show fire with 500,000?
Because one, the supplemental is for furloughs of mainly civilians, and the $10 million is in from the sworn account.
Okay, but I thought attachment 1 of the supplemental was talking about structural.
No, there's a civilian portion of the furloughs that the fire department would also experience. And so this would be their portion of that amount.
So this only deals with civilians, the 500,000?
Yes.
So if they come up with the 500,000 structurally, they can eliminate the 10 furloughs?
The 10 additional.
Okay, I got you now, okay. But this other item on the first original report remains at the $10 million mark?
That's correct.
Okay. Any other questions of the chief while he's here?
Now, concurrent to the work, the action that's taking place on the civilian side, you may want to adopt an amendment to allowing the chief to come back with an alternative plan for the 10 million, not just on the civilian side, but for all of it.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, Chief, also, when you talked about the fire
Plan
special
14.
duty positions, the 700,000 of the fire special duties, isn't there now a relationship with most of the venues that they're picking up all of these costs? We negotiated a lot of that with them from last year.
We're trying to do full cost recovery on as many events as we possibly can. But for instance, in Hollywood, the nightclub activity has spiked tremendously, and we've had to reassign one fire inspector from one area to the Hollywood area to assist in inspecting and making sure that these nightclubs are safe. So, as business comes back, our workload increases, but...
And when you get into a situation like that, to me, safety is number one. If it's police or fire or the other things that are preventive or intervention strategies to do with safety. When you see a safety concern, will you be clear enough so that we fund for that? Or how will you deal with an issue if there is a safety issue about having an inspector in a new club or something?
Worst case scenario, we'll take an on-duty resource, a fire resource, to conduct a fire life safety inspection. Worst case scenario, after hours, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, an illegal nightclub, and we'll work together with LAPD to close that occupancy.
And at this point in time, this particular day, the 10th of January, how is your response time? Because most of your work is paramedic work, right? About 82%.
Well, our workload, I mean, even though we've seen a 13% reduction in staffing,
right.
I mean, we're still running 1,200 calls, incidents a day. We're still transporting in excess of 500 people a day to area emergency rooms. Even though the workforce is shrinking, the call load is increasing. Mm-hmm. So we're just as busy as we ever have been.
And do we still have that understanding with my hillsides and the Palisades, the canyons and Brentwood, that if we do get into a red flag situation, which we haven't been lately, which we're fortunate about, that you would suspend the modified program in those areas on those
we're continuing to monitor our staffing deployment model on a daily basis, and weather is a factor. Yes, and we do suspend the MCP when deemed necessary.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions of the chief? Thank you very much, Chief.
Thank you, sir.
Let's go to the next item.
Following item is transfer of savings identified in the financial status report from aging, and that's $150,000.
Okay. Is anyone from Aging here to comment?
Good afternoon, Marco Perez with the Department of Aging.
Any comment on this recommendation on the $150,000 on attachment 1 of the original report?
Yeah, there will be a recommended transfer of $150,000 from salary savings for this purpose.
Okay, so you have no,
You can handle this.
you can handle that 150?
Absolutely, we can take care of that. Shouldn't be a
All right,
problem.
what about the issue of looking at any structural changes for this or next year?
Well, one of the things that we will have difficulty at this time is we have to, because we're mostly grant-funded, it would be very difficult for us to determine which contracts could be canceled at
When
this
you
point.
say grant funded, their position 100% grant funded, no city?
Oh, I'm sorry, I can hardly hear you.
100% grant funded, no city subsidy or upfront costs?
Our percentage is somewhere in the neighborhood of about 10% is general fund. Most of it is grant-funded.
Okay, all right. So, Miguel, we made you 150,000 in
right.
2 hours.
That's right.
Okay, all right. Let's go to the next
So if we're
item.
here for another 4 days, we might find the money?
The next item is instructing the city attorney to absorb $1 million of the reported remaining deficit of $4 million. If you recall in the operation plan, one of the recommendations after the, related to the city attorney was that there'd be a subsidy provided to the city attorney's office from various accounts in the unappropriated balance and other general fund accounts to provide this $4 million subsidy to deal with their deficit. What we're saying is that we would reduce that subsidy to $3 million and require the city attorney to develop a plan to absorb that additional $1 million.
Okay, go over that again. Anybody from city attorney's office? No. Go over that again, Ben, what you said on the city, for the city attorney.
Sure. In the operation plan, we identified a deficit for the city attorney, and they presented recommendations to deal with a significant part of that deficit. However, there was still $4 million deficit remaining. What we said in the operation plan was that the general fund from other sources would cover that $4 million. Now what we're saying is that we could only cover $3 million of that $4.
Okay.
And so they would be required to find that additional $1 million.
Okay, also, when you go to the supplemental attachment 1, again, those numbers jump to 3 million?
Well, yes.
Again, that's for
That's for the
regarding
furloughs.
right?
I mean, but again, I want to make sure they understand we're dealing with
That's
two separate books.
That's right.
Okay.
And we haven't heard from the city attorney in terms of how they would implement that.
Okay.
Oh, they just submitted something? Have you read it? Yeah. We just got something now, so.
Okay.
Ida Rubio with the CAO's office. The city attorney did submit a written memo to us indicating what the impact is of the additional furloughs. They stated that that $3 million would potentially be devastating to their department. As far as their criminal branch, they would probably have to shut down certain divisions within their criminal branch and shift personnel to courtroom duties. In addition to that, there's additional programs that would probably have to be eliminated, which would be the gang injunctions, the neighborhood prosecution programs, and other types of litigation related to consumer protection crimes that are being enforced. And they would have to revert back to their core mission within their criminal branch. Related to their civil branch, they would have to be reduce the municipal advice services that they provide to council. So what that means is attorneys that have to attend certain meetings, commission meetings or city council meetings, they would have to be reducing some of those services, and they would only be able to staff critical meetings, and there would be a reduction in preparation of ordinances that are being prepared. As far as their civil litigation division, they would have to essentially pick and choose which lawsuits they would be representing, and they do not advise that type of workload. For their civil branch as the entire branch, they would have to go back to their core mission, which would be workers' compensation, collections, and defending the city in civil liability actions.
Okay. Could we ensure that each committee member gets a copy of that report?
Yes.
And also this in the council file? And then we can go to the next item. Any other questions on city? Sorry, go ahead.
I'm not sure if I misheard what you said at the beginning. Did you say cutting $3 million or cutting $1 million?
There was, as far as the furloughs, The city attorney's office would have to take $3 million in furlough savings. That's their target. And what they've done is they've submitted a memo, and they've discussed all the service impacts related to the $3 million.
So the $1 million that's on the list of cuts, is that in addition to the $3 million?
That's in addition.
So we're talking about a $4 million cut to the city attorney's office.
That is correct, and three of the $4 million would be dealt with through furloughs, and then $1 million would be done through reductions.
And there's still $3 million that is being absorbed.
That is correct. I mean, I think that what Ben started off saying is that the department was at a $4 million shortfall. The city's basically had originally committed to take care of that $4 million. We're saying we're no longer commit to that, so we're asking the department to take $1 million and the same furloughs that all other city employees are being asked to take.
Let me ask you this. Carmen Tutanich has shown real leadership in that department and talks about revenue-generating aspects of the city attorney's office, and that it's almost cut your nose to spite your face. If they go back in some personnel in some areas that are revenue-generating, we'd have issues. Now, I haven't seen that memo there that you just referred to. Does he imply that in that would, in fact, impact his ability to bring in the revenue streams that his department has been more aggressive with on workman's comp and even dealing with some of these signage issues and so on?
Some of the activities that he's identified within the criminal branch are related to consumer protection litigation. And so some of those activities do bring in revenue if there's a lawsuit. Where we win the lawsuit, then we obtain
so
some of the revenues.
can you make a case that, in fact, you'll generate more revenue than with these
He
cuts?
didn't make a case in his memo. He's just saying that some of these activities would have to be curtailed.
Yeah, but if they were curtailed, would that impact the revenue stream that we hope from the department?
It could, but those revenue streams, we don't program those into the budget. So we only program city attorney when they project their revenues. As far as litigation, they only project a minimal amount of revenues that can go towards general fund.
I see. Miguel?
Well, I mean, this has been an ongoing discussion with the city attorney. I think that he has proposed various initiatives to try to raise more revenue, and my office is working with his office to figure out a different approach at looking at how some of these cases are handled, and the policy decision that needs to be made by this committee and the council as to whether he should be entitled to receive a portion of those earnings. Currently, they go to the general fund. Is something that will need to be deliberated sometime in the next several months. But
when we deliberate it, can we get a full picture of what revenue he has been generating for the general fund? Because obviously, if the revenue he's generating for the general fund would cover his costs and also
Then
assist
some.
the general fund.
That's the thinking.
That's frankly where I want to go.
Right. Okay.
One other.
But let me ask you this, Miguel, on these revenue, have we gotten any proposals regarding revenue generation that, I mean, we had the one administrative report that's being vetted, but have we gotten any other reports from the city attorney about?
Not a specific one that's ready for your consideration.
Okay, so, but the issue is, I think the issue of liability and being able to defend the city is a valid point, but the issue is whether these revenue producers that have been discussed, if they've not come forward, then that's revenue we can't count on.
That's correct.
Well, I know that having around 10,000 LAPD officers always remains kind of a sacred cow politically, but has anyone ever done any analysis to compare the real public safety impacts of cutting a graffiti program in half or cutting some of the city attorney's very public safety focused activities like gang injunctions and other such things? Have we ever done that, and are we looking at that as we cut the city attorney's budget now, whether that will result in a crime increase from not being able to prosecute gangs, et cetera, et cetera? I'd ask that both the CAO and the city attorney's office.
I'm with the CAO. We haven't done any detailed analysis like that.
Representing the city attorney's office there. But, so no analysis of that has ever been done?
Well, these, it's all depends on what areas a city attorney decides to cut. That's an argument that the city attorney makes that as part of the public safety process, that to the extent to which there are less prosecutions and you go after crime, quality of life kinds of crime, there's a direct impact to crime that exists in the neighborhoods, using sort of the broken window theory. There's no doubt that these reductions will have that impact. It's he provides. We'll make copies of the letter. He provides sort of a laundry list of almost all the functions that he is responsible for, and discusses sort of an overall reduction in those functions to the extent to which those that impact public safety versus some other area will know based on how he implements it. But his memo doesn't enumerate specifically how that would be done.
Yeah, I just express my concern about cuts in this arena from,
What time is it?
most of these are bad choices, from losses in public safety to other areas like one we discussed in personnel, that we have inadequate staffing and workers' compensation, and the less you provide in staffing, the less cost-effective you are and the more money you ultimately expend. So I hope that we're not making cuts that either jeopardize public safety or actually cause a net loss in revenue and dig us in a bigger hole, both of which sound likely by making some of these cuts.
Let me just remind everyone, I think the issue that we recommended that report come back, we'll bring back all of those recommendations, so we'll see them. So today, we're not invoking nor approving any cuts, so that we can see what the departments either propose for structural, what they propose for furloughs, what they propose for the original report, item 1, that identifies the deficit. So that report, you said, would be back for January the 30th. All right. So let's go quickly through, because I've just been reminded that there's a small athletic activity going on this evening, and so for those that have an interest, we don't want them to go through the red light in their neighborhood red light program and be a photo on the front page of the paper. So let's go through on the next one, Convention Center. Any issues on that? We'll take your nod, no.
Philip Hill, Assistant General Manager, Convention Center. We're positioned to support.
Very good. Let me just ask, when we say increase, does that mean they have not in the past fulfilled 100% of their overhead?
They operate in the black within the framework that we give them. I mean, there's still the debt service that the city has to pay for on an ongoing basis, but the department has actually done a good job in trying to minimize the impact to the general fund, and we appreciate the fact that they're willing to take this additional $100,000.
All right, very good. Let's move on to the next one, ITA.
The next item related to ITA is actually a reversal of one of the operation plan recommendations. In the operation plan, we had recommended that this funding go to the ITA to deal with their deficit, but obviously here we are reversing that recommendation.
Any questions on ITA?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we're back to that discussion we've had in the last budget cycle about the 5% and the 1% and the monies that will be going toward public access. Is that still being preserved?
That's a report that's forthcoming.
Right.
Good afternoon, Mark Wolf with ITA. Yes, Councilman, that report is going to Budget and Finance in the next few weeks.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions on ITA? Okay, we can go to the next item.
The next item is reducing funding for mayor and council by $1 million collectively.
We're going to give that money up, so let's move on.
Okay. The next item is reducing funding for the planning department by $1 million, and this would reduce their ability to complete the community plans that are currently in progress.
Is there somebody here from the
Yeah,
planning
the general
department?
manager is here.
Yeah. I just want to be real clear from my end, with the planning department in my district, it means a lot. These community plans, it becomes the lifeline for a lot of the activity of community groups, neighborhood councils, and homeowner groups.
Correct. Michael LeGrand, General Manager, Department of City Planning, Director of Planning. Yes, this $1 million would have a significant impact on our policy program. 25% of our budget is currently funded through the general plan. The last few years, we've worked with this committee to really reduce our dependency upon the general fund, but many planning activities aren't driven by applications from developers or from people doing kitchen additions, for example. Depend upon the general fund to be funded. The major effort we're doing is updating our number of our community plans, and this cut this late in the fiscal year would basically stop our ability to produce those plans and continue them. What's more alarming to me is the fact that many of those we've had done environmental impacts reports on, and we've funded those reports through the council. And those reports get stale over a number of years, and to the extent we take too long to get the plans out, many of those EIRs will have to be redone when we do have the economy to go back and fund those plans. We're at a real critical crossroads. I really do not want to see us become a department of case processing. I think advanced planning is something this council and the mayor have really gotten behind and seen the value of when we have good plans that really bolster the vision for a neighborhood and help preserve those unique characteristics in communities in Los Angeles. And this $1 million would basically stop our current planning our advanced planning program we have right now, our case management services, our nuisance abatement and revocation section, and all the pending community plans we have underway.
Will this impact, in a multiplier effect, jobs in a community? Obviously, planning is the first step in creating a project.
Correct. We're currently focusing a lot around the infrastructure through Measure R and the investment that the city has made in transit communities. And by stopping a lot of the measures that we're working on, we wouldn't have the ability to have the zoning in place and have context in place so that when we see the investment for the rail lines come in, that we make sure they fit within the characteristics of the neighborhood. They have the right height, the right design, attractive public open spaces to accommodate that growth.
Yeah, well, when we go before the process in the council, I definitely want to support you on this and not see that $1 million eliminated. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have some of the same concerns. I won't repeat what Councilmember Rosendahl said other than to agree with them. I would just ask the mayor's representative how the mayor feels about this cut, because it would seem to be something that would fly in the face of the direction that I think he's been going in otherwise to do better planning and to fund it adequately. Is the mayor in support of this? And has he not considered the damage that this would cause in the more positive direction we've been going on
This
planning?
was, we just received a letter from the mayor. I don't know if you have a copy of it.
I don't.
In response to summarize, what is it? He supports both the reductions. It says, I urge you in the most respectful but strongest possible terms to adopt and advance a final parking concession agreement to maximize the values of the structures to meet or exceed the 53 million general fund revenue target contemplated. And I also concur with the CAO and CLA in their assessment that we must move forward with budget balancing options immediately in order to responsibly prepare to solve next year's projected $350 million deficit. The CAO and the CLA have provided the council with a number of alternatives which will generate significant ongoing savings this fiscal year. I urge you to seriously consider the city's analysts' recommendations and to adopt the most aggressive package of reductions possible, consistent, of course, with the council's policy objectives. He doesn't specifically reference any particular cut, but that's the tenor. We'll make copies of the letter.
Yeah, I'm just wondering whether he's actually given adequate focus to this particular cut, and it's counterproductive and somewhat inefficient nature in terms of moving forward some of the things that need to be planned.
I could share with you that we involved his office and the CLA in putting together this list. And again, this is an example of of a contract. Most of the $1 million, my understanding, would be the reduction or the elimination of contracts versus on the employee side. And that's part of the reason why we identified this as a particular target.
Well, it wouldn't be one of my first choices. I think it winds up being one of those that costs us money in the long run. So.
Miguel, when you read the mayor's letter, did you get to the last paragraph?
Would you like me to read the last paragraph?
Yeah.
The last paragraph says, however, the council chooses not to approve a responsible P3 parking agreement nor approve the budget reductions recommended by the CAO and the CLA. I will have no option but to order our city's general managers to effectuate position eliminations, including layoffs, necessary to balance the city's current fiscal year budget. I've had copies of the letter made. It was just handed to me about 10 minutes ago.
And one of the things I think would be important for Wednesday, if you could include this as part of your presentation for P3.
We will do so.
Forthcoming. Any other comments on planning?
Just to be clear, we're not passing anything today to council, just moving all this forward as information. So any motions we want, we should do on Wednesday.
Yeah.
Just, may I have a quick for planning then? If we follow this blueprint and you can't, because of the union agreements you have, solve for the problem without eliminating services, there's a number, I think it was either 5 or 7 community plans that were already well along the process. Are they far enough along that we can take a work product at least and pass those?
We're looking at some of those issues right now, Councilman. For example, the Hollywood Community Plan, the draft EIR is currently going to be available next month. The draft plan is ready on the streets. Some of those plans we think we could still muster enough staff work to go through. Just to be clear, though, this isn't contract money. This is mostly reimbursement for staff money in terms of our general fund obligations. So these cuts would actually be staff positions we have to relocate over to our current planning side of the department.
Well, I understand. I'm just questioning if you're
terms
close
of
enough that
plans,
we could
yes.
either allocation of a few resources for a few months, get a product out. Maybe it's not perfect, maybe it's not all what we wanted, but something, because some of these plans are so old, at least we'd have some completion on them rather than
Yes, there's
stopping.
probably 1 or 2 out of the 6 that are currently underway that we'd be able to, we feel, go pretty far along with to finish up, even with this cut. It's the remainder ones, such as still Margarita Hills, West Adams, South LA, and Southeast LA, that would really be truly jeopardized. Hollywood and San Pedro, we're still analyzing the impact on those 2 plans.
Okay, let's go to the next.
The next item is a reduction of graffiti removal services by 50% of the estimated remaining balance, and that would be about $1.5 million.
Yeah. And you can merge the two of them because clean and green and graffiti are fairly similar.
I'm sorry, I couldn't.
Merge the next two with clean and green and graffiti removal.
Yes, if you include the clean and green, that's another additional $500,000 for a total of $2 million.
Okay. And that's both of those in the same department?
I think those dollars are managed by the board, the Public Works Board.
All right. Any comments?
Yes, hi, Paul Roch, Office of Community Beautification. And it is the board's position that these would be some devastating impacts to all communities within the city of Los Angeles. You're talking about a 50% reduction in graffiti abatement services, which would basically mean that about 8.1 million square feet of graffiti would not be removed, that would typically be removed for this 6-month period. About 150,000 locations of graffiti would not be abated, and approximately 40 jobs would be lost through the community-based organizations that currently perform the work for the Office of Community Beautification. These contractors were cut about 15% already at the beginning of the fiscal year, have not received any increase in funding for the past 4 years, although their costs have been rising based on insurance payments, cost of gasoline, rental costs, etc. We do see graffiti removal not only as an issue of blight throughout the city of Los Angeles, but also an issue of public safety and economic development.
Okay. Any questions on either one of those 2 items, the clean and green or the graffiti? Okay, thank you. Next.
The next item pertains to suspending the March police hiring class and then increasing the class sizes for April, May, and June to account for this one less class, and that would be a savings of $200,000.
Okay. Could you also merge that one for discussion with attachment 2 that addresses the...
Sure. Attachment 2 of what we consider to be Phase 2 would be the actual elimination of any more classes this fiscal year. So while the first recommendation in Attachment 1 only suspends the hiring in March, Attachment 2 would actually eliminate any additional hiring, beyond January.
Okay. Can we have the police department up? I'd just like to comment on, we merged 2 items, one on the attachment 1, phase 1, that deals with reduction of a class, but merging it into the subsequent classes, and then on phase 2 deals with stopping hiring altogether, and then on attachment 1 of the supplemental discusses approximately a $5 million structural alternative to eliminate the 10 furloughs. And so to kind of merge those together would be important.
Do you want me to go first? Jerry Chaliff, Los Angeles Police Department. To take him in order, we have agree with the suggestion of deferring the class in March, which was what we always intend to do, is to review the hiring as we go forward in light of the motion passed by the council, and we would know then what by sometime in February would have known what our requirement is in March, but we can defer that to March. The department would oppose the issue of not hiring at all, which would reduce the department by about another 100 officers through attrition. That's an estimate. We also believe that if we stopped hiring, we would have a problem going forward and starting the hiring up again, because the list gets stale and they have to be certified by the personnel department, and there's a delay there. So that could end up depleting the department by 200 to 300 officers by the time we're able to rehire. If we couldn't hire for the whole next year, we estimate that our attrition rate next year will be about 375, which means we could have a force that's down below into the 9400s, which would be like a reduction of 450 from what we have now. And I think that's a discussion that ought to be made in the context of the impact as seen by the presentation made last week. The reduction of crime, there's almost a one-to-one, I don't want to say it's one-to-one, but there is a relationship between the size of the force and the amount of crime that occurs. So that's a discussion, I think, a policy decision that should be made in a greater context. As far as the structural savings of approximately $5.4 million, I'm unable at this time to say that we could have a definite plan. It would be incredibly difficult. I'm not sure if we could possibly do it all. In light of what the council members talked about today, we're reviewing I've started a review again of all of our contracts to see if there are contracts we could terminate. Unfortunately, most of our contracts are for items that are necessary, such as transporting prisoners, paying prisoners, and things like that. But we're going to review them all. The other problem we have is we had, as I think Councilman Smith said, implied, the ground's always shifting under us. So the latest is the uniform allowance that was paid on December 22nd, and we were given some indication that might not come out of our budget. I don't see anything happening in that. If that comes out of our budget, it makes it even more difficult to try to find savings. In relation to the civilian furloughs, I have a list and can present a list whenever it's appropriate of all the things that will impact from the answering of 911 calls down through detention officers and all the other services that we provide if in fact we have to do an additional 10 furloughs, which is asking our employees to take myself included, and I understand the ramifications of this, but be tantamount to an 18%, I think, payroll reduction in pay for this fiscal year. So the answer is, I can't answer the 5.4 million, but I can tell you about the impact it has on the not hiring.
Okay. Let me just ask, so I'm clear, on your first statement on the merging or the March class into subsequent classes, did I understand you said that was, you supported that, or?
Yes, we agree. We can, I don't know if support is a strong word, but we understand the need for it, and we will, that we believe that that's appropriate.
But you do not support on the option 2?
No, we believe that
And then
hiring should continue.
And then you will have information to the CAO regarding the impact of the 10 days furlough and also the 5.4 million if you went to structural.
Yes, we've already submitted an initial letter to the CAO last week about the impact of the 10 additional furlough days.
Very good. So we'll, that will be part of the January 30th report.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, question. What would the impact be if we allowed attrition to go forward and to the point where we lost several hundred sworn officers, but we replaced them at the same time by civilians, so that we didn't have an officer-run jail system, et cetera? Would that in any way have a negative impact on anything other than the public promise to have around 10,000 officers?
Yes, but do you want to, but we'll do one thing. Initially, the police officers going into the jail for the initial 6 months, at least, after about 6 months from now, when the hiring is taking place of the lower salary, it's cheaper to put officers in there than to hire additional detention officers. Because the police officers now start at $44,000 a year. Detention officers started somewhere in the $50,000 range. The second issue is, if you give up hiring police officers, it takes, and if we stopped, it would take a year and a half to start hiring again. And if you hire police officers, and even if you use them by putting them in the jail, you have them. So if there's an emergency, an earthquake, whatever, like we've had in the past, you have sworn police officers are trained to perform police duties, and you don't have to try to find additional officers. They're there. We're just not using them. Additionally, this is something that detention officers doing time in the jail for some short period of time was done up till about 10 years ago, 15 years ago?
Approximately 10 years ago. I went to the jail when I got off probation. Sandy Jo MacArthur from the police department. To specifically answer one of the points of your question, we, as you know, we don't have the paid overtime. So there would be a huge impact to us if we stopped hiring because of the compensatory overtime issue. Our officers are still out there making arrests every single day, and they're making a lot of arrests. And unfortunately, what goes along with arrests and comes court, and we have a lot of overtime. So if we were to stop hiring today, it would have a significant impact on our ability to put police cars on the street.
Well, I don't understand how that would be if you're putting sworn officers in jail and you replace them with jailers. How those sworn officers are generating any arrests while they're in jail is beyond me. Also, there's a question which you could answer because you had the same circumstance, whether training and then going into the jails for a significant period of time doesn't leave you rusty in terms of your training when you get back out.
The department in the past, when I was in the jail, and it's the same model that we're using now, the officers rotate into the jail for 6 months, so it does not impact their training. The sheriff's department obviously does it, but they do get retrained prior to coming out. In our case, there would not have to be any retraining after 6 months. If it was extended for over a year, then yes, there would be training concerns. But to specifically speak to the issue of officers in the jail, if we were putting all of our officers in the jail, I would agree with you that there would be a huge number in the jail, but if you're talking additional furloughs, our officers, I'm not quite sure that that we're talking apples and apples. So I think that the concern about not hiring, that's 97 officers right now going to the jail, or 87 officers going to the jail. Stopping hiring, we'd fall far below an additional 87 officers, and that's what I was speaking to.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Let me just ask one question regarding the police. I think it was a comment made. Have we made a decision where the $9.5 million is coming from for uniform deferral of that cost?
Well, the 9.5, which was identified in the second FSR, was added to the overall deficit, and so it's not necessarily coming from any one. It's just being addressed as part of this entire exercise.
I mean, but it's coming from...
That's a nice way of saying the department's paying for it.
No, we're not saying the department's paying for it. What we're saying is that the deficit that was identified is to be addressed through these various measures that were being proposed. So it's being, in essence, allocated throughout the entire city.
Yeah, so it's not coming out of their budget, but you're paying for it out of the cuts?
Yes.
I think it sounds like what they're talking about, the fire department trying to find an extra $10 million after they were told they only need to find $10 million. If we have to find the $9.5 million, it's going to be catastrophic.
No, we weren't asking the department to find the 9.5. We're saying that it's being added to the deficit, and then the deficit is being addressed through these number of reductions.
So we're not going to charge it to you, but you're going to have to reduce your budget on the other side of it.
That's one way of looking at it.
Only in government can we dream this stuff up. This is amazing.
I got just a couple. I know you want to run to Rec and Park.
No, that's okay. I'm just...
Okay. You heard my challenge to Chief Beck when we were standing out there over at the police headquarters of finding funding within the overall, and your overall budget is what?
$1.17 billion.
From us, and then the overall budget when you add up all the other parts of it?
No, that's our overall budget.
How about the federal government types of money?
Well, that would reduce the overall budget from the city, because all our revenue that comes in goes in the general fund. So we don't get credit for it.
Okay, how do I deal with my constant constituent concern about an able-bodied officer in a civilian job? And when you say, well, the civilian jobs have been frozen, we can't deal with it, how do you deal with it?
Well, part of it is we don't have that many. I think we're down to 26.
I heard 57.
57, it depends on how, but some of those 57 are
when we just looked at all of our numbers, we have 26 officers that dedicate 100% of their job to civilian jobs that are able-bodied. We have 57 that are doing some part of their job as civilian job as well as sworn jobs, so it's a combination. But there's 26 officers that we've been able to identify. We're trying to update those numbers now. As you can imagine, it takes a long time to do that. Especially since we don't have as many civilians to be able to do that research. But we are trying to update that right now. But as of the last report, 26 were able-bodied officers who were 100% of their job was doing civilian jobs, and most of that was in crime analysis.
Okay, I'd like to see those numbers, because the last time I saw a paper, it's been all over the lot. First it was like 1,200, of which 700 were somewhat able-bodied but not, another were permanently disabled, and then it got down to some part-time sharing and this and that and everything else. Because I want to see the day where an able-bodied officer is out on the beat, period, and not in a civilian job.
Well, there's two issues. There's different numbers. There's temporary light duty, there's permanent light duty, so you have those out of the equation. Then the question is, what is a civilian job? Do you need sworn officers doing crime analysis? Well, you may, and that's then not a civilian job. So we will present a report that lists all of what they're doing. And the other problem we have is sometimes we're told, for example, that, I don't know, some other department's going to do X, and then all of a sudden it's not in their budget, so they come to us to say us to do it, which causes a restructuring. So there's a number of issues, but we'll present a report which will be a snapshot as of a particular period of time of what it is.
Okay, and the jailer business, that's going to be brought back to committee
I
about?
think it comes to committee at the end of January.
Because obviously, I don't want an able-bodied officer to be on the street working in the jails.
We all understand that.
Okay. And the last thing I have is overtime pay. Can we get to a culture within the rank and file where you don't get paid overtime? You follow a case just like a council member works 24/7. They work 24/7. Let's assume if they make over $100,000 a year or something like that, how do we control the overtime aspect of the money? I know the duty's the duty, don't get me wrong. We're all here serving. But it's somewhat tough on me to pay overtime in one department, and in another department we're firing people or furloughing people. It just doesn't work. How do we get around
Well, first of all, you have the federal law, the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act, that requires us to pay people if they work overtime. Second of all, you have union contracts that limit how much pay, like the agreement to let the officers bank up to 400 hours before they get any cash. So it's not as easy as just saying change the culture and everybody work overtime like you do or I do or Chief MacArthur does. The question is, what can you do within the framework of the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act, state acts, agreements with labor unions? So I think that they all have to be analyzed before you do that. But the bottom line is, as of right now, if somebody's at the rank of lieutenant or below, they get paid overtime, eventually. Right now, it's deferred, but they will get paid overtime.
Right. And deferring the classes, will that impact the 9,963?
Yeah, it could, but hopefully not significantly, by just deferring the class in March. If we cut off all hiring for the year after this class, the answer is yes, it will, by about 100, I think.
And what do you expect for attrition during this next period?
I think it's about 100. That's the number I've been citing. It may be a little more, a little less.
It's between 100 and 130, depending on if people decide to retire, that we don't expect.
But next year, we expect significantly more.
I see. Thank you.
One last question. I know we cut back substantially in overtime. What would be the equivalent in terms of sworn officers that we lost with that cut?
I think, as of right now, there's, I can't give you exactly, but I think it's in the 400 or 500s, based on the not being able to have overtime.
Yes, it depends on, of course, how busy this season is, or how busy it is out in the streets. Near the end of summer, we were up into the nearly 400 mark, and I think we're hovering right below it right now.
And we made a cut that had the equivalent of a pretty good chunk of the force. What was the negative impact in terms of our crime statistics? Did things get worse, or did they continue to get better?
Let me reframe what it is. What happened is, because of the overtime limit, that meant that after about 400 hours, after 250 hours, people had accumulated that, they began to have to take time off. So that's where that number comes from. Counter to that, though, the chief took what he felt were all the available officers he could out of specialized units, administrative duties, and moved them into the field. So right now it was balanced. Going forward, there aren't that many officers left to put back in the field, so if we start losing officers, they're going to be officers that are being lost from deployment.
So he made some good deployment decisions to cover that hole.
Yes.
But you don't see other opportunities that are there as sort of low-hanging fruit to make up for the difference?
Yeah, you can cut out some of the fat, but now we're down to muscle, and we still need certain kinds of units to do specialized work. There are a number of other specialized programs that we're analyzing right now to see if we might have to discontinue some of them.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Go to Rec and Park.
Thank you.
The next two items pertain to recreation and parks. The first one is having the department forego $1 million from the additional $2 million that the city council adopted as part of their budget this fiscal year. And the other item is for the department to reimburse the general fund for the refuse collection services to the tune of about $1.8 million for the remainder of this fiscal year. Collectively, it's $2.8 million from the department.
Okay, is anybody from Rec and Parks?
Why would we charge the Rec and Parks for trash collection? It seems ridiculous. Because you can't just get it away from free. Why not? It's part of the city family.
Regina Adams, Executive Officer, Recreation and Parks. First of all, Mr. Mercury would like to apologize. He was here earlier, and he had to leave, so he apologizes for not being here at this time. So you have me. With this reduction, this is an additional $2.8 million reduction for the Department of Recreation and Parks. Where these funds would come from is from a $4 million general fund allocation that we received this year. Of that $4 million, $2 million was to, for us to provide landscaping at the city buildings, in the public buildings, which is police stations, fire stations, libraries, etc. That is the only way that we can continue to provide the landscaping services is if we're given the funding to do that. Per the charter, and because we are slowly being moved toward becoming a proprietary department, we can no longer use our funds for that purpose. And so before, in the budget in the past, we had received general funds to be able to do that. Also, the additional $2 million that we had received this year for the general fund was for us to continue and not make any cuts in our Class Parks program. Class Parks is our Clean and Safe Spaces program, which is basically aimed at teens and getting them into programs where we can take them to places that they normally would not be able to go to, and also get them training and so forth that they might not be able to do, mostly aimed at at-risk children. With this reduction of $2.8 million, we would immediately no longer be providing the landscaping services for the other city public buildings. And we also would have to look at if we might have to implement furloughs. Right now, our department is exempt from furloughs, but with this reduction, we may have to start implementing furloughs between now and the end of this current fiscal year. We had already, because the money that was given to us was basically, of the $4 million that we received this year, it was $3.5 million was put into our part-time salary account, and $500,000 was put into a materials account. Of course, we're already halfway through this fiscal year, and we've already expended some of those funds, so if this additional $2.8 million is taken from us, then there are things that we would have to implement immediately. We are looking at how we would do that. If we were to try to implement furloughs, then we have to probably close some of our facilities, or most of our facilities, one day per week. And that's something that we will have to look at and see what that will mean.
Okay. Any comments, Rec and Park?
If you looked at what the public safety impacts would be of closing some of our parks one day a week?
We're looking at various things. We're trying to figure out how can we keep most of the services going, which we no longer, it's very difficult for us to be able to do that. Our parks have already been implemented. Our first priority is to make sure that the parks are accessible to the public. However, in our part-time budget, we already, for this current fiscal year, had already received about a third of our budget cut for our part-time salaries for our part-time staff. This proposed reduction would take another approximately 7% away from that. We use our staff, of course, for providing a lot of the programming that's out there. We also use them for cleaning the restrooms and maintaining the parks for the public to be able to access. We are looking at everything we can. We're looking at partnerships. We're trying everything. However, it's becoming more and more challenging. This current fiscal year, we've already been tasked to absorb about $38 million out of our budget, and this additional would take us over $40 million. So it's very challenging for us to try to keep things going. We're not going to be able to keep everything going the way we have in the past.
Well, I'm not looking as much at programs. I'm just thinking in terms of whether we have a greater likelihood with being closed one day a week of graffiti, facilities damage, gang activity, whether any of those things we're anticipating will impact with that.
Yes, it will be an impact, but also too for us, as far as for facilities, of course, we rely on general services through their officers to also help us in that way, but of course, they're being reduced and cut as well. So yes, there will be additional graffiti. It would take us longer to try try to paint and remove the graffiti, yes, there will be impacts.
Yeah, one more thing that sounds like it could be a negative for us beyond just the direct services to people that use the park. So that would be a concern for me as well. Thank you.
One comment, I heard you mention the partnership, private sector partnership. I understand there's been some concerns of how you implement that and various strategies. Whatever we need to do as a council to support you in that public-private partnership, be it to do with signage and other things, we want to be there for you, because I do believe we're not going to make it through this crisis without partnering with private sector groups that believe in the parks in given neighborhoods or in a financial state that naming a bench after them or some kind of a ceremony would help. I want to do whatever we can to keep our parks open and robust. It's obviously part of an intervention prevention strategy, and it's a better spent dollar than the incarceration model. Obviously, the more active kids are, the more they enjoy the parks, the happier I am. That's why in my district, as you know, the Quimby funds are helpful in creating various venues for families to enjoy the parks more productively. But practically every park in my district has neighborhood groups that consider themselves very happy to have a park, and they want to work with us in various ways. And even if we end up having to reduce some hours, for God's sake, don't reduce them on Saturdays and Sundays. We have to find days in the week if we were to get to that point where the park is less used as the best strategy to do it. And I don't want 3 people working in the park on a Friday and then there's nobody there on a Saturday or a Sunday. So staffing patterns and all of that might have to be surfaced. And I think, at least from my perspective, any park in my district, I want to have a close hand on that aspect of it if we ever get down to that.
That is true. We would definitely have to look at possibly changing the work hours for the employees and the work days. For example, we know that seniors prefer to have the programs during the day, so we would probably try to keep those programs going in earlier parts of the day. But then maybe for other programs, we might have to maybe start at noon instead of earlier in the day like we are now. Right. And of course, which days potentially would be the day that if we have to close down, what would be the best day? Of course, we'd have to look at it from both our recreation staff as well as for our maintenance staff, because there are different needs there. Yeah. Also, too, for the administrative staff, of course, we may have to try to coordinate that. If there are other furlough days happening across the city, then we'd probably have to coordinate that with the other city departments. So it's not just one brush that we could use.
And we also have to coordinate it with the revenue stream groups that come in and use our parks for different venues that particular night that soccer group from so-and-so pays X dollars. We don't want to slow that down in any way either.
Yes, correct.
Good luck. Thank you.
I move those items that go, the next 3 appear to be sweeping of funds that are available and with no impact on the construction projects.
That's correct. That's correct. The 2 under the non-departmental are exactly that, is sweeping of funds that were unspent related to some capital projects. The one underneath, additional revenue, that is increasing related cost reimbursements from Stormwater Pollution Abatement Fund and gas tax.
Okay. And then it appears the last one of great would be of some concern would be the phase 2 on the reduce the reimbursement on the EAA furloughs. Could you explain that?
Yes. As I mentioned earlier, there are a couple of recommendations that are reversals of recommendations made in the operation plan. One was related to ITA, the other one related to city attorney. This is another one that partially reverses one of the recommendations in the operation plan, and that's reducing the amount of funds that would be transferred to departments to make up for the reduction in the EAA furloughs for this fiscal year. So originally, these departments listed here were set to receive a dollar amount that's double what's being proposed now.
Okay. And then we've discussed already the police hiring. We've discussed a portion of the mayor council. Now, the last 3 there, if my understanding that in dealing with SPRF on the first 2, that we will deal with that as part of the 5-year rolling plan for SPRF.
Well, what we're recommending it under phase 2, we're assuming that the P3 is not going to move forward, and the larger point that we're trying to make is that we need to, if we're going to be in the parking garage business, we need to then decide whether we're going to be charging market rates, what kind of subsidies are we going to be providing, and how that revenue should be used. And so these are our estimates of what potentially could be generated should we begin to change the current structure that we have in terms of rates themselves. And so that would be part of a solution to eliminate the entire deficit that we see so far.
The thing is, I want to make sure that we gave a direction to LADOT to do a 5-year rolling report before we talk about not paying back or what we can take from SPRF. I think we need to see what that report reflects on how they're going to maintain the parking lots and the meters over time so that we can see what the investment is. So if we can include those as the 5-year, and then the last one, I believe, would be a part of the P3 study on the subsidy issue on Hollywood and Highland.
That's correct.
Okay, so colleagues, we've gone through the issues. The only thing I think that we've recommended is that on January the 30th, or before that, we'll get a report that addresses the issue of the furloughs, the structural deficit, or the contracts as options. Everything else we'll send to council without a recommendation, so we can discuss it on Wednesday. That's fine. I think that's a concurrence.
And basically, departments need to respond to those so that there's something substantial to put into that January 30th
Well,
report.
yes,
So.
departments have to respond so that we get their input on all three of those items. So that's the one direction that we'll add to the committee report. Okay? So with that, we'll move that item to council with that one direction dealing with that report back.
Thank you.
Okay? Do we have anything else?
Not on this particular item.
Well, we'll move that item, but any other items that we've not addressed?
I think we have quite a few. We have 7, 9, and 12.
Yeah, Smokey, the 12 already has a solution in the recommendation, right? The funding for that was recommended. On 12? So I move the recommendation.
So 12 was basically instruction for the CEO to come back with a particular funding source. Given sort of the constraints that we have this year, not a lot of extra funds lying around, one of the options that the council could consider is taking $50,000 out of the citywide special event portion money for this particular.
Why not take that out of the smoking transfer we get every year? Why not get that out of the money we get every year on the smoking settlement?
It would simply be then taking money from the general fund that's already been programmed for the budget. So you could take it, but then it just means we have to find somewhere to make that $50,000 up.
You're saying that all of is that the tobacco money? All of it's been in?
Tobacco, yes. It comes in as a general fund receipt and has been programmed for a slew of different general funded activities.
Okay. Can we look at that and see what might be relieved during this year for tobacco money and see if it may be more appropriate for this as opposed to what it was allocated?
Or even if you can split it, take a little from there, because it's not going to get all spent.
It seemed to tie, the thing is, that we just basically, bottom line, we have to find $50,000 somewhere. So it's either here or...
But if it isn't all spent and they already allocated money went to the city attorney's office, I believe?
Now, if you're talking about the fee is something totally different.
No.
Tobacco revenue that comes in as a general fund receipt has already been programmed in the budget.
Okay, never mind.
That's why I had offered as a potential option, you can look at the citywide special event money. It's not what it was necessarily designed for, but yet it is a citywide proposal, advertising program for non-smoking.
But when you're talking about the smoking, is that the same thing we call the tobacco tax, or we get money and they do the sting operations and things of that nature?
Settlement.
This is basically, yes, from tobacco settlement funds that we get every year. That amount is roughly between $10 and $11 million right now.
Okay, but what do we do with it? I mean,
You program it in the budget.
okay. Where is the money or what we get for tobacco that they actually give some of it to the police department to do investigations for illegal cigarettes or minors buying cigarettes? Is that the same source?
But that would be a different source. I know there's a tobacco fee where we have people go in and do random inspections and things of that sort. That's with the city attorney, but that's a fee for service.
Or it's a fee, I suppose, okay.
And I'm not aware of any other tobacco funds out there the city has.
Okay. And we're talking 50,000? Okay, so between the CA and CLA, you'll figure out what the source is?
Well, the recommendation is just take it out of the citywide special event.
As an option, you could take it out of the citywide portion of the special event.
Okay, you want to do that? We'll take it out of that, we'll make that recommendation to move forward on this educational program.
Okay.
That's, let me see, do we have?
That leaves only 7 on the fire department and on the fees for brush clearance.
Yeah, I think 7 was basically Kokori and Smith, motion to direct the fire department to suspend for 6 months submission of collection agencies of any delinquent fees under the hazardous vegetation inspection fee program.
Let me see if the people on 12, if they're still here. Robert Berger,
The amendment is not to, what was the amendment? We're not going to.
I think it's DECE, Dalsey, Esther Schiller, Stephen Gallegos, and Monty Nex.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your...
What is your name, sir?
My name is Robert Berger. I am Project Director of Project Trust at the LA County Tobacco Control and Prevention Program. And I wanted to thank you for your support of smoke-free outdoor dining. As you know, the policy will go into effect on March 8th. And we know how strapped the city is. And the good news is that with our funding from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and Health and Human Services, we have allocated ourselves over $200,000 to the successful introduction of smoke-free outdoor dining. We know the key to the success of these policies is community awareness and education. We don't want to put the burden on law enforcement. That's not, we know how stretched they are, and the idea is to make sure people are aware so that this can become the new social norm. The numbers we have, smoking rates are going down. We also need to take a positive approach because the latest county numbers were 14%, latest state numbers are even lower. Non-smokers want to enjoy outdoor dining again, so we need to take a positive approach because that's going to, in fact, build business. We have copies, so with your contribution, and keep in mind other cities like Santa Monica, Burbank, Glendale, Beverly Hills have had large campaigns, $100,000, $150,000 for a relatively small city. So we're asking for the city to contribute, to partner, and make this important statement. We do have copies of our logo. If I could pass those around. Fresh Air Dining LA. It's very positive, very upbeat. This is going to be a celebration of the fine outdoor dining in LA, and this money will be very well spent on our public education campaign.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Councilmember Parks, members of the committee, thank you very much for your action today.
What is your name?
I'm sorry, Esther Schiller, Director of Safe Smoke-Free Air for Everyone, here as a volunteer today and to thank you for your action. Years ago, thank you, when the city required most restaurants to become non-smoking, the city did send out letters to the restaurant owners. The restaurant owners were told to post signs, remove ashtrays, and this empowered the people who were going to the restaurants. If someone didn't notice a sign, they could say, "Sir or Madam, could you please put out your cigarette?" And in that way, there was compliance. And this action that you've taken today will ensure compliance. Because of the law that the city passed years ago to make the restaurants non-smoking, the state took a similar action, and I think we can expect something similar again. It lowers cancer rates, it lowers heart disease rates. It's a marvelous thing that you've done. Thank you.
You're going to do both, no matter what.
Let the infection go from the finger to the cutting.
Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Gallegos. I'm chair of the Coalition for Tobacco-Free Los Angeles County. Today, your committee has been tasked to consider the painful duty of making budgetary cuts that have an impact on the life and pulse of the city. We are also here to consider direct costs of $4.2 billion to Los Angeles County taxpayers to pay for the tobacco use-related disease and death that knows no income level, race, or privilege. Tobacco use continues to cut down people in their prime of life and offers the guarantee of a permanent furlough. Many cities are fighting back, fighting for the life of their residents, fighting for the health of their children and seniors who's most at risk from exposure to secondhand smoke. From the time that we've been taking a look at cities that have adopted 100% smoke-free outdoor dining, like the city of Los Angeles, we've seen that number grow in the last couple of years from 35 to 54 communities. Most of those communities have adopted public campaigns which allow the citizens to know that these laws exist. Also in these communities, when we see these laws change, we see that businesses, the dining businesses actually get more customers, and cities have seen increased amounts of revenue. We are vested in seeing Los Angeles become successful in this campaign and vested in the success of all of our businesses here in Los Angeles, as well as the health of all Los Angeles residents. I thank you very much for your consideration and support for this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Is it Monty? And also, is it Oso? Can't pronounce the last name.
Messick.
Messick, okay.
Monty Messick, Deputy Director with the LA County Tobacco Control and Prevention Program, Councilmember Parks and colleagues. I just wanted to follow up on a couple of comments that Robert said, and also say that in January, when the council unanimously adopted this policy, Councilmember LaBonge looked to us, to my office, and to the other advocates that were here to be part of the public awareness campaign and helping to let the public know about the law. And so it's really good to see this day that we're here and we're talking about partnering with the city on this. And in addition to the $200,000 that our office is going to put towards it, as Robert said, for a multi-pronged public awareness campaign that's going to kick off in February. That's going to include outdoor advertising, radio, and mailing to businesses. And also our environmental health program that does a letter grading is also going to, over the next year, hand out signage and brochures to all the businesses that they go to. Finally, I just wanted to also say that for Councilmember Smith, for your office with John Lee, and also with Councilmember LaBonge's office with Lisa Schechter, have been great partners over the summer as we've developed the logo that Robert shared and other components of the public awareness campaign. So I think it's been a really great partnership between the county, between health advocates, and between the city of Los Angeles. Look forward to our success on this campaign. Thank you.
Thank you. And there's a representative from the American Heart Association. We'll just add your card to the file. So we'll move item number 12 with the recommendations from the CAO as to a source of funds. We have one other item.
Going back to item, the motion number 7, do you want to approve that, or you want to hold that for a couple of weeks?
I think Mr.
Basically,
Smith may
report
have
back from the fire department.
A motion.
On the fire department, I think what we want to do is go forward with this, give the authority of the department to go out and start putting it on, go forward collecting. But I didn't want to do, have the department go out and get collection agency to go after people who didn't pay something that wasn't their fault. And I'm really questioning whether we should carry forward on collecting of late fees and things like that. So my understanding is there will be no late fees in this. Is that correct? Yeah, John.
It's John Hisford,
Councilmember Krikorian's office. The initial fee for $13, when people did not get that or pay that, they were then billed for $39, and the number did that. If it were to go to collections, it could go to $52, but then, of course, it would be the burden of being in collections, which can impair your credit.
Correct.
Our concern is, at this juncture, there's about 15,000 individuals who may be in arrears. The problem is, at least 12,000 of those may not have gotten the initial mail because there were problems. So our recommendation that we've discussed was the possibility of rolling the delinquent fees or last year's fees into the billing, which will take place this year. And it seems to me that that way there'd be a greater likelihood of making an effort to collect. Simply say, our records indicate that you did not pay last year, therefore, here's this year's bill and last year's bill.
Make it very clear it's a 2-year billing.
Yes, it would
So that
make it
they
very clear,
understand-
and if they failed that, then it might well go to
That's
collections.
different, yeah. But make it very clear that this is a 2-year billing.
Right.
Rather than 1 year.
They missed the previous
Yeah,
year.
and you won't be held responsible for any late fees unless you don't pay this.
Right.
Okay.
That's- I think
If we
that
can
would
do it
be
in
the-
that way, then we'll let people off the hook for not their fault. Okay.
We'll make sure the fire
Get that?
department understands that direction.
Okay. So we'll move that item with the direction Mr. Smith has given, and we'll add the cards. Dr. Clyde Williams is not here for both item 7 and public comment. Do we have anything else?
Okay. The last item is item 9, and that's a CO report relative to the authorization to substitute and/or extend the letter of credit agreement.
Which item is that?
That's item 9. This is for the commercial paper program.
Okay. Any questions, colleagues, on item 9? We approve the CAO's recommendations?
No.
Yes. Okay. We'll move item
Move for
9
approval.
as recommended.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we're adjourned. Thank you.
And that is it.